Thoughts on Art and Life by Leonardo da Vinci. Introduction. The long obscurity of the Dark Ages lifted over Italy, awakening to a national though a divided consciousness. Already two distinct tendencies were apparent. The practical and rational on the one hand was soon to be outwardly reflected in the burgher life of Florence and the Lombard cities, while at Rome it had even then created the civil organization of the Curia. The novella was its literary triumph. In art it expressed itself simply, directly, and with vigor. Opposed to this was the other great undercurrent in Italian life, mystical, religious, and speculative, which had run through the nation from the earliest times, and received fresh volume from medieval Christianity, encouraging ecstatic mysticism to drive to frenzy the population of its mountain cities. Umbrian painting is inspired by it, and the glowing words of Jacopone da Todi expressed in poetry the same religious fervour which the life of Florence and Perugia bore witness to in action. Italy developed out of the relation and conflict of these two forces, the rational with the mystical. Their later union in the greater men was to form the art temperament of the Renaissance. The practical side gave it the firm foundation of rationalism and reality on which it rested. The mystical guided its endeavour to picture the unreal in terms of ideal beauty. The first offspring of this union was Leonardo. Since the decay of ancient art, no painter had been able to fully express the human form, for imperfect mastery of technique still proved the barrier. Leonardo was the first completely to disengage his personality from its constraint, and make line express thought as none before him could do. Nor was this his only triumph, but rather the foundation on which further achievement rested. Remarkable as a thinker alone, he preferred to enlist thought in the service of art, and make art the handmaid of beauty. Leonardo saw the world not as it is, but as he himself was. He viewed it through the atmosphere of beauty which filled his mind, and tinged its shadows with the mystery of his nature. To all this, his birthright as a painter, a different element was added. A keen desire for knowledge, guiding his action in life, spurred him onward. Conscious of this dominant impulse, he has fancifully described himself in a Platonic allegory. He had passed beneath overhanging cliffs on his way to a great cavern. On bended knees, peering through its darkness, fear and desire had overwhelmed him. Fear for the menacing darkness of the cavern, and desire to ascertain if there were wonders therein. From his earliest years, the elements of greatness were present in Leonardo, but the maturity of his genius came unaffected from without. He barely noticed the great forces of the age which in life he encountered. After the first promise of his boyhood in the Tuscan hills, his youth at Florence had been spent under Verrocchio as a master, in company with those whose names were later to brighten the pages of Italian art. He must then have heard Savonarola's impassioned sermons, yet, unlike Botticelli, remained dumb to his entreaties. He must have seen Lorenzo the Magnificent. But there was little opening in the Medician circle for the young painter, who had first to gain fame abroad. The splendour of Milan under Il Moro, then the most brilliant court in Europe, attracted him. He went there, proclaiming his ability in a remarkable letter to accomplish much, but desiring chiefly to erect a great monument to the glory of the Sforza. He spent years at that court, taken up by his different ventures, painting, sculpture, engineering, even arranging festivals, but his greater project was doomed to failure, enmeshed in the downfall of Ludovico. Even to this he remained impassive. Visconti dragged to prison, his son dead. The Duke has lost his state, his possessions, his liberty, and has finished nothing he undertook, was his only comment on his patron's end, written on the margin of a manuscript. After the overthrow of the Duke of Milan began his Italian wanderings. At one time he contemplated entering the service of an Oriental prince. Instead, he entered that of Caesar Borgia as military engineer, and the greatest painter of the age became inspector of a despot's strongholds. But his restless nature did not leave him long at this. Returning to Florence, he competed with Michelangelo. Yet the service of even his native city could not retain him. His fame had attracted the attention of a new patron of the arts, prince of the state which had conquered his first master. In this his last venture he forsook Italy, only to die 3 years later at Amboise, in the castle of the French king. The inner nature of Leonardo remained as untouched by the men he encountered as by the events which were then stirring Europe. Alone he influenced others, remaining the while a mystery to all. The most gifted of nations failed to understand the greatest of her sons. Isabella d'Este, the first lady of her time, seeking vainly to obtain some product of his brush, was told that his life was changeful and uncertain, that he lived for the day, intent only on his art. His own thoughts reveal him in another light. "I wish to work miracles," he wrote. And elsewhere he exclaimed, "Thou, O God, sellest us all benefits at the cost of our toil. As a day well spent makes sleep seem pleasant, so a life well employed makes death pleasant. A life well spent is long." Leonardo's views of aesthetic are all important in his philosophy of life and art. The worker's thoughts on his craft are always of interest. They are doubly so when there is in them no trace of literary self-consciousness to blemish their expression. He recorded these thoughts at the instant of their birth, for a constant habit of observation and analysis had early developed with him into a second nature. His ideas were penned in the same fragmentary way as they presented themselves to his mind, perhaps with no intention of publishing them to the world. But his ideal of art depended intimately, none the less, on the system he had thrown out seemingly in so haphazard a manner. His method gives to his writings their only unity. It was more than a method, it was a permanent expression of his own life, which aided him to construct a philosophy of beauty characteristic of the new age. He had searched to find a scientific basis for art, and discovered it in the imitation of nature, based on rational experience. This idea was in part Aristotelian, imbibed with the spirit of the time, though in the ordinary acceptance of the word Leonardo was no scholar, least of all a humanist. His own innovation in aesthetic was in requiring a rational and critical experience as a necessary foundation, the acquisition of which was to result from a permanent condition of the mind. He had trained his own faculties to critically observe all natural phenomenon, first try by experience, and then demonstrate why such experiment is forced to operate in the way it does, was his advice. The eye, he gave as an instance, had been defined as one thing. By experience he had found it to be another. But by imitation in art, Leonardo intended no slavish reproduction of nature. When he wrote that "the painter strives and competes with nature," he was on the track of a more Aristotelian idea. This he barely developed, using nature only partly in the Stagirite's sense, of inner force outwardly exemplified. The idea of imitation in fad as it presented itself to his mind was twofold. It was not merely the external reproduction of the image, which was easy enough to secure. The real difficulty of the artist lay in reflecting inner character and personality. It was Leonardo's firm conviction that each thought had some outward expression by which the trained observer was able to recognize it. Every man, he wrote, has as many movements of the body as of varieties of ideas. Thought, moreover, expressed itself outwardly in proportion to its power over the individual and his time of life. By thus employing bodily gesture to represent feeling and idea, the painter could affect the spectator whom he placed in the presence of visible emotion. He maintained that art was of slight use unless able to show what its subject had in mind. Painting should aim, therefore, to reproduce the inner mental state by the attitude assumed. This was, in other words, a natural symbolism, in which the symbol was no mere convention, but the actual outward projection of the inner condition of the mind. Art here offered an equation of inward purpose and outward expression, neither complete without the other. Further than this, influenced by Platonic thought, Leonardo's conception of painting was, as an intellectual state or condition, outwardly projected. The painter who practiced his art without reasoning of its nature was like a mirror unconsciously reflecting what was before it. Although without a manual act painting could not be realized, its true problems of light, of color, pose and composition, of primitive and derivative shadow, had all to be grasped by the mind without bodily labor. Beyond this, the scientific foundation in art came through making it rest upon an accurate knowledge of nature. Even experience was only a step towards attaining this. "There is nothing in all nature without its reason," he wrote. "If you know the reason, you do not need the experience." In the history of art as well, he urged that nature had been the test of its excellence. A natural phenomenon had brought art into existence. The first picture in the world, he remarked in a happy epigram, had been a line surrounding the shadow of a man cast by the sun on the wall. He traced the history of painting in Italy during its stagnation after the decay of ancient art, when each painter copied only his predecessor, which lasted until Giotto, born among barren mountains, drew the movements of the goats he tended, and thus advanced farther than all the earlier masters. But his successors only copied him, and painting sank again until Masaccio once more took nature as his guide. A quite different and combative side to Leonardo's aesthetic, which forced him to state the broad principles of art, appears in his attacks on poetry and music as inferior to painting. In that age of humanistic triumph, literature had lorded it over the other arts in a manner not free from arrogance. There was still another cause for his onslaught on poetry. Leonardo resented the fact that painters, who were rarely men of education, had not defended themselves against the slurs cast on their art. His counterattacks may have been intended to hide his own small scholarship. It served another end as well. His conception of the universal principles of beauty was made clear by his defense. His first principle stated broadly that the most useful art was the one which could most easily be communicated. Painting was communicable to all, since its appeal was made to the eye. While the painter proceeded at once to the imitation of nature, the poet's instruments were words, which varied in every land. He took the Platonic view of poetry as a lying imitation, removed from truth. He called the poet a collector of other men's wares, who decked himself in their plumage. Where poetry represented only a shadow to the imagination, painting offered a real image to the eye, and the eye as the window of the soul through which all earthly beauty was revealed, the sight, he exclaimed, which had discovered navigation, which had impelled men to seek the West, was the noblest of all the senses. Painting spoke only to what it accomplished. Poetry ended in the very words with which it sang its own praises. If, then, poets called painting dumb poetry, he could retort by dubbing poetry blind painting. In common with his successors, Leonardo could not escape from this fallacy, which, in overlooking all save descriptive verse, was destined to burden aesthetic until demolished by Lessing. It was the opinion of Leonardo that the temporary nature of music caused its inferiority to painting. Although durability was in itself no absolute test, else the work of coppersmiths would be the highest art, yet in any final scale, permanence could not altogether be disregarded. Music perished in the very act of its creation, while painting preserved the beautiful from the hand of time. Helen of Troy, gazing in a mirror, in her old age, wondered how she had twice been ravished. Mortal beauty would thus vanish, if it were not rescued by art from destroying age and death. Leonardo contrasted painting with sculpture, for he had practiced both, and thought himself peculiarly qualified to judge their merit. He considered the former the nobler art of the two, for sculpture involved bodily toil and fatigue, while by its very nature it lacked perspective and atmosphere, color, and the feeling of space. Painting, on the other hand, caused by an illusion, was in itself the result of deeper thought. An even broader test served to convince him of its final superiority. That art was of highest excellence, he wrote, which possessed most elements of variety and universality. Painting contained and reproduced all forms of nature. It made its appeal by the harmonious balance of parts, which gratified all the senses. By its very duality it fulfilled the highest purpose. The painter was able to visualize the beauty which enchanted him, to bring to reality the fancy of his dreams, and give outward expression to the ideal within. The genius of Leonardo as a painter came through unfolding the mystery of life. Like Miranda, he had gazed with wonder at the beauty of the world. "Look at the grace and sweetness of men and women in the street," he wrote. The most ordinary functions of life and nature amazed him most. He observed of the eye how in it form and colour and the entire universe it reflected were reduced to a single point. Wonderful law of nature, which forced all effects to participate with their cause in the mind of man. These are the true miracles. Elsewhere he wrote again, "Nature is full of infinite reasons which have not yet passed into experience." He conceived it to be the painter's duty not only to comment on natural phenomena as restrained by law, but to merge his very mind into that of nature by interpreting its relation with art. Resting securely on the reality of experienced truth, he felt the deeper presence of the unreal on every side. In the same way that he visualized the inner workings of the mind, his keen imagination aided him to make outward trifles serve his desire to find mysterious beauty everywhere. Oftentimes, in gazing on some ancient, time-stained wall, he describes how he would trace thereon landscapes with mountains, rivers, and valleys. The whole world was full of a mystery to him, which his work reflected. The smile of consciousness, pregnant of that which is beyond, illumines the expression of Mona Lisa. So, too, in the strange glance of Anne, of John the Baptist, and of the Virgin of the Rocks, one realizes that their thoughts dwell in another world. Leonardo had found a refuge in art from the pettiness of material environment. Like his own creations, he too had learned the secret of the inner life. The painter, he wrote, could create a world of his own and take refuge in this new realm. But it must not be one of shadows only. The very mystery he felt so keenly had yet to rest on a real foundation. To treat it otherwise would be to plunge into mere vapouring. Although attempting to bridge the gulf which separated the real from the unreal, he refused to treat the latter supernaturally. That mystery which lesser minds found in the occult, he saw in nature all about him. He denied the existence of spirits, just as he urged the foolishness of the will-o'-the-wisps of former ages, alchemy and the black art. In one sentence he destroyed the pretensions of palmistry. "You will see," he wrote, "great armies slaughtered in an hour's time, where in each individual the signs of the hands are different." His art took, thus, its guidance in realism, its purpose in spirituality. The search for truth and the desire for beauty were the twin ideals he strove to attain. The keenness of this pursuit saved him from the blemish of egoism which aloofness from his surroundings would otherwise have forced upon him, for his character presented the anomaly, peculiar to the Renaissance, of a lofty idealism coupled in action with irresponsibility of duty. He stood on a higher plane, his attitude toward life recognizing no claims on the part of his fellow-man. In his desire to surpass himself, fostered by this isolation of spirit, and spurred on by the eager wish to attain universal knowledge, he has been compared to Faust, but the likeness is only half correct. He was not blind to the limitation which encompassed him, his very genius making him realize their bounds. Of the ancients he said that in attempting to define the nature of the soul, they sought the impossible. He wrote elsewhere, "It is the infinite alone that cannot be attained, for if it could, it would be finite." In Leonardo's personality was reflected both the strength and weakness of Renaissance Italy. So to know him, it is necessary to understand the Italy of that age. Its brilliancy, its universality, its desire for beauty are but one side of the medal. On its reverse, Italy lacked the solid vigour of a national purpose. The discord of political disunion, reacting on art, laid bare great weakness in the want of any constructive direction toward which the strength of the Renaissance could aim. The energy was there, whether finding an outlet in statecraft or in discovery, in art or in letters. But it labored for no common end. There was internal unity of force and method, but external divergence of purpose. The tyranny of petty despots could provide no adequate ideal toward which to aim. No ruler and no city save Venice could long symbolize the nation's patriotism. Venetian painters alone glorified the state in their work, and thus felt the living force of a national ambition which raised them above themselves. But elsewhere there was little to inspire that devotion for a common country necessary as a background to sustain the greatest work. Hence Italian art, so living within certain limits, remained stunted beyond these. The conviction that art existed in order to express ideal beauty, that its main purpose was to please the eye and the senses in spite of the result attained, proved inadequate compensation for all that had been withdrawn. The art ideal tended more and more to become a conscience and a purpose in itself, an inward impulse for action and an outward goal. The artist's real greatness will depend at all times on his qualities as a representative. His true merit will arise from giving expression in ideal terms to his nation and to his age. In so far as he has been able to do this and the spirit of his country is reflected in his work, in so far as he has represented what is best therein and most enduring, he will have achieved greatness. Not that this is always or even often a conscious expression. It is unfair reading to search for deep thought in the work of either painter or poet. Neither art offers the best medium to convey the abstractions of the mind, since each has its own method of expression, independent of pure reason. But painter and poet, in the degree they attain greatness, express more than themselves. Aristo, intent only to amuse, reflects with playful wit and skepticism the splendid luxury and joy of living in Renaissance court life. The care with which he chiseled each line proves that his real seriousness and conscience lay in his artistic purpose. Without Aristo's wit, Paolo Veronese depicted a similar side in painting, though his Venetian birthright made him celebrate the glory of the Republic. Poet and painter alike expressed far more than either could know. If such a test be applied to the artists of the Renaissance, each in turn will respond to it, just as the weakness of the later Bolognese as a school is that, beyond a certain technical merit, they meant and represented so little. But the noblest painters, Michelangelo and Raphael, Titian and Leonardo, in addition to possessing the solid grasp of technical mastery, reflected some aspect of their nation's life and civilization. In Michelangelo was realized the grandeur of Italy struggling vainly against crushing oppression. He expressed that which was highest in it, reflecting the loftiest side of its idealism mingled with deep pessimism in his survey of life, for, wrapped in austerity, he saw mankind in heroic terms of sadness. Raphael, on the other hand, found only beautiful sweetness everywhere. The tragedies of life failed to touch the young painter, who blotted from view all struggle and sorrow, and in spite of the misery which had befallen his nation, could still rejoice in the sensuous beauty of the world. There was another side to the Renaissance, dependent neither on beauty nor heroic grandeur, yet sharing in both true qualities of its own. Titian, who painted the living man of action, the man of parts, susceptible alike to the appreciation of ideal beauty and heroic impulse, but guided withal by expediency, reflected this more practical aspect of life. In his portraiture he expressed the statecraft for which Italians found opportunity beyond the Alps, since in Italy it was denied them, and Titian found even Venice too narrow for the scope of his art. But before Titian, before Raphael, before Michelangelo, Leonardo reflected the rationalism and the mystery, the subtlety and the philosophical speculation of the age. To find in his work only the individual thought of genius would be to mistake perhaps its most important side, for the expression of his mind, both by its brilliancy and its limitations, is typical of the spirit of his time. The Italian Renaissance was reflected in him as rarely a period has been expressed in the life work of a single man. He represented its union of practice and theory, of thought placed in the service of action. He summed up its different aspects in his own individuality. Intellectually, he represented its many-sidedness attained through penetration of thought, and a keenness of observation, profiting from experience extended into every sphere. As an artist, he possessed a vigor of imagination from which sprang his power of creating beauty. But in spite of his practical nature, he remained a dreamer, in an age which had in it more of stern reality than of golden dreams. His very limitations, his excess of individualism, his want of long-continued concentration, his lack of patriotism, his feeling of the superiority of art to nationality, are all characteristic of Renaissance Italy. The union in Leonardo of reality to mystery has often been shared by genius in other fields. His own peculiar greatness sprang from expressing in art the apparent contradiction of attaining the world of mystery through force of reality. Like Hamlet, it was the union of the real with the unreal which appealed to him, of the world as he saw it and the world as he imagined it to be. It was but another expression of the eternal ideal of truth and beauty. L.E. American Embassy, London, 1906. End of section 0.
Thoughts on Life, Part 1. Of the Works of Leonardo. Begun at Florence, in the house of Piero di Braccio Martelli, on the 22nd day of March, 1508. And this is to be a collection without order, taken from many papers which I have copied here, hoping to arrange them later, each in its place, according to the various subjects treated. And I think that before I shall have finished this work, it will be necessary for me to repeat the same thing many times over. So, O reader, blame me not, because the subjects are many, and memory cannot retain them and say, "This I will not write because I have already written it." And if I did not wish to fall into this error, it would be necessary, every time that I wish to copy something, in order not to repeat myself, to read over all the preceding matter, all the more so since the intervals are long between one time of writing and another. His thirst after knowledge. Not louder does the tempestuous sea bellow when the north wind strikes its foaming waves between Scylla and Charybdis, nor Stromboli nor Mount Etna when the sulphurous flames, shattering and bursting open the great mountain with violence, hurl stones and earth through the air with the flame it vomits, nor when the fiery caverns of Mount Etna, spitting forth the element which it cannot restrain, hurl it back to the place whence it issued, driving furiously before any obstacle in the way of its vehement fury. So I, urged by my great desire and longing to see the blending of strange and various shapes made by creating nature, wandered for some time among the dark rocks, and came to the entrance of a great cave, in front of which I long stood in astonishment and ignorance of such a thing. I bent my back into an arch and rested my left hand on my knee, and with my right hand shaded my downcast eyes and contracted eyebrows. I bent down first on one side and then on the other to see whether I could perceive anything, but the thick darkness rendered this impossible. And, after having remained there some time, two things arose within me, fear and desire. Fear of the dark and threatening cave, desire to see whether there were anything marvelous within. I'd discover for man the origin of the first, and perhaps of the second cause of his being. Leonardo's studies. Recognizing, as I do, that I cannot make use of subject matter which is useful and delightful, Since my predecessors have exhausted the useful and necessary themes, I shall do as the man who by reason of his poverty arrives last at the fair, and cannot do otherwise than purchase what has already been seen by others and not accepted, but rejected by them as being of little value. I shall place this despised and rejected merchandise, which remains over after many have bought, on my poor pack, and I shall go and distribute it, not in the big cities, but in the poor towns, and take such reward as my goods deserve. Vain knowledge. All knowledge which ends in words will die as quickly as it came to life, with the exception of the written word, which is its mechanical part. Avoid studies, the result of which will die together with him who studied. Value of knowledge. The intellect will always profit by the acquisition of any knowledge whatsoever, for thus what is useless will be expelled from it, and what is fruitful will remain. It is impossible either to hate or to love a thing without first acquiring knowledge of it. Men of worth naturally desire knowledge. It is ordained that to the ambitious, who derive no satisfaction from the gifts of life and the beauty of the world, life shall be a cause of suffering, and they shall possess neither the profit nor the beauty of the world. On his contemners. I know that many will say that this work is useless, and these are they of whom Demetrius said recked no more of the breath which made the words proceed from their mouth than of the wind which proceeded from their body. Men who seek solely after riches and bodily satisfaction, men entirely denuded of that wisdom which is the food and verily the wealth of the soul, because insomuch as the soul is of greater value than the body, so much greater are the riches of the soul than those of the body. And often when I see one of these take his work in his hand, I wonder whether, like a monkey, he will not smell it and ask me if it is something to eat. On the vulgar. Demetrius used to say that there was no difference between the words and the voice of the unskilled ignorant, and the sounds and noises of a stomach full of superfluous wind. And it was not without reason that he said this, for he considered it to be indifferent whence the utterance of such men proceeded, whether from their mouth or their body, both being of the same substance and value. I do not consider that men of coarse and boorish habits and of slender parts deserve so fine an instrument, nor such a complicated mechanism as men of contemplation and high culture. They merely need a sack in which their food may be held and whence it may issue, since verily they cannot be considered otherwise than as vehicles for food, for they seem to me to have nothing in common with the human race save the shape and the voice. As far as the rest is concerned, they are lower than the beasts. Knowledge of the past and of the places of the earth is the ornament and food of the mind of man. Knowledge, the supreme good. Cornelius Celsus. Knowledge is the supreme good. The supreme evil is physical pain. We are composed of two separate parts, the soul and the body. The soul is the greater of these two, the body the lesser. Knowledge appertains to the greater part, the supreme evil belongs to the lesser and baser part. Knowledge is an excellent thing for the mind, and pain is the most grievous thing for the body. Just as the supreme evil is physical pain, so is wisdom the supreme good of the soul. That is to say, of the wise man, and no other thing can be compared with it. Life and wisdom. in the days of thy youth seek to obtain that which shall compensate the losses of thy age. And if thou understandest that old age is fed with wisdom, so conduct thyself in the days of thy youth, that sustenance may not be lacking to thy old age. Praise of knowledge. The fame of the rich man dies with him, the fame of the treasure, and not of the man who possessed it, remains. Far greater is the glory of the virtue of mortals than that of their riches. How many emperors and how many princes have lived and died, and no record of them remains, and they only sought to gain dominions and riches in order that their fame might be everlasting. How many of those who lived in scarcity of worldly goods in order to grow rich in virtue, and as far as virtue exceeds wealth, even in the same degree the desire of the poor man proved more fruitful than that of the rich man. Dost thou not see that wealth in itself confers no honor on him who amasses it, which shall last when he is dead, as does knowledge? Knowledge which shall always bear witness, like a clarion to its creator, since knowledge is the daughter of its creator, and not the stepdaughter, like wealth. The world. Bountiful nature has provided that in all parts of the world you will find something to imitate. The beauty of life. Consider in the streets at nightfall the faces of men and women when it is bad weather. What grace and sweetness they manifest! Just as iron which is not used grows rusty, and water putrefies and freezes in the cold, so the mind, of which no use is made, is spoilt. Fruitless study. Just as food eaten without appetite is a tedious nourishment, so does study without zeal damage the memory by not assimilating what it absorbs. Truth was the only daughter of time. In praise of truth. So vile a thing is a lie, that even if it spoke fairly of God, it would take away somewhat from his divinity. So excellent a thing is truth, that if it praises the humblest things, they are exalted. There is no doubt that truth is to falsehood as light is to darkness, and so excellent a thing is truth that even when it touches humble and lowly matters, it still incomparably exceeds the uncertainty and falsehood in which great and elevated discourses are clothed. Because, even if falsehood be the fifth element of our minds, notwithstanding this, truth is the supreme nourishment of the higher intellects, though not of disorderly minds. But thou who feedest on dreams dost prefer the sophistry and subterfuges in matters of importance and uncertainty to what is certain and natural, though of lesser magnitude. Obstacles in the way of truth are finally punished. Versus humanists. I am well aware that, not being a literary man, the presumptuous will think that they have the right to blame me on the ground that I am not a man of letters. Vainglorious people! They know not that I could make answer as Marius did to the Roman people, and say, "They who make a display with the labors of others will not allow me mine." They will say that, being unskilled in letters, I cannot find true expression for the matters of which I desire to treat. They do not know that in my subjects experience is a truer guide than the words of others. For experience was the teacher of all great writers, and therefore I take her for guide, and I will cite her in all cases. Although I may not be able to quote other authors as they do, I can quote from a greater and more worthy source, namely, experience, the teacher of their masters. They go about swelled with pride and pomposity, dressed up and bedight. not with their own labor, but with that of others, and they will not concede me mine. And if they despise me, who am a creator, far more are they, who do not create but trumpet abroad and exploit the works of other men, to be blamed. Authority. He who in reasoning cites authority is making use of his memory rather than of his intellect. On commentators. Men who are creators and interpreters of nature to man, in comparison with boasters and exploiters of the works of others, must be judged and esteemed like the object before the mirror as compared with its image reflected in the mirror, one being something in itself, and the other nothing. Little to nature do they owe, since it is merely by chance they wear the human form, and but for it I might include them with herds of cattle. A well-lettered man is so because he is well-natured, and just as the cause is more admirable than the effect, so is a good disposition, unlettered, more praiseworthy than a well-lettered man who is without natural disposition. Against certain commentators who disparage the inventors of antiquity, the originators of science and grammar, and who attack the creators of antiquity, and because they, through laziness and the convenience of books, have not been able to create, they attack their masters with false reasoning. It is better to imitate ancient than modern work. Experience. Wisdom is the daughter of experience. Experience never errs. Wrongly, men complain of experience, which, with great railing, they accuse of falsehood. Leave experience alone, and turn your lamentation to your ignorance, which leads you, with your vain and foolish desires, to promise yourselves those things which are not in her power to confer, and to accuse her of falsehood. Wrongly men complain of innocent experience, when they accuse her not seldom of false and lying demonstrations. Experience never errs. It is only your judgments that err, ye who look to her for effects which our experiments cannot produce. Because given a principle, that which ensues from it is necessarily the true consequence of that principle, unless it be impeded. Should there, however, be any obstacle, the effort which should ensue from the aforesaid principle will participate in the impediment as much or as little as the impediment is operative in regard to the aforesaid principle. Experience, the interpreter between creative nature and the human race, teaches the action of nature among mortals. How, under the constraint of necessity, she cannot act otherwise than as reason, who steers her helm, teaches her to act. All our knowledge is the offspring of our perceptions. Origin of knowledge. The sense ministers to the soul, and not the soul sense. And where the sense which ministers ceases to serve the soul, all the functions of that sense are lacking in life, as is evident in those who are born dumb and blind. Testimony of the senses. And if thou sayest that sight impedes the security and subtlety of mental meditation, by reason of which we penetrate into divine knowledge, and that this impediment drove a philosopher to deprive himself of his sight, I answered that the eye, as the lord of the senses, performs its duty in being an impediment to the confusion and lies of that which is not science but discourse, and by which, with much noise and gesticulation, argument is constantly conducted. And hearing should do the same, feeling, as it does, the offence more keenly, because it seeks after harmony which devolves on all the senses. And if this philosopher deprived himself of his sight to get rid of the obstacle to his discourses, consider that his discourses and his brain were a party to the act, because the whole was madness. Now, could he not have closed his eyes when this frenzy came upon him, and have kept them closed until the frenzy consumed itself? But the man was mad, the discourse insane, and egregious the folly of destroying his eyesight. Judgment prone to error. There is nothing which deceives us as much as our own judgment. The greatest deception which men incur proceeds from their opinions. Avoid the precepts of those thinkers whose reasoning is not confirmed by experience. Intelligence of animals. Man discourseth greatly, and his discourse is for the greater part empty and false. The discourse of animals is small, but useful and true. Slender certainty is better than portentous falsehood. What is an element? It is not in man's power to define the quiddity of the elements, but a great many of their effects are known. That which is divisible in fact is divisible in potentiality also, but not all quantities which are divisible in potentiality are divisible in fact. End of section 1. Thoughts on Life, Part 2. Infinity Incomprehensible. What is that thing which is not defined and would not exist if it were defined? It is infinity, which, if it could be defined, would be limited and finite, because that which can be defined ends with the limits of its circumference, and that which cannot be defined has no limits. O contemplators of things, do not pride yourself for knowing those things which nature by herself and her ordination naturally conduces, but rejoice in knowing the purposes of those things which are determined by your mind. Insoluble questions. Consider, O reader, how far we can lend credence to the ancients who strove to define the soul and life, things which cannot be proved, while those things which can be clearly known and proved by experience remained during so many centuries ignored and misrepresented. The eye, which so clearly demonstrates its functions, has been, up to my time, defined in one manner by countless authorities. I, by experience, have discovered another definition. Beauty of nature's inventions. Although human ingenuity may devise various inventions which, by the help of various instruments, answer to one and the same purpose, yet it will never discover any inventions more beautiful, more simple, or more practical than those of nature, because in her inventions there is nothing lacking and nothing superfluous, and she makes use of no counterpoise which she constructs to the limbs of animals in such a way as to correspond to the motion of their bodies, but she puts them in the soul of the body. This is not the proper place for this discourse, which belongs rather to the subject of the composition of animated bodies, and the rest of the definition of the soul I leave to the minds of the friars, the fathers of the people, who know all secrets by inspiration. I leave the sacred books alone, because they are the supreme truth. Completeness in knowledge. Those who seek to abbreviate studies do injury to knowledge and to love, because the love of anything is the daughter of this knowledge. The fervency of the love increases in proportion to the certainty of the knowledge, and the certainty issues from a complete knowledge of all the parts, which, united, compose the totality of the thing which ought to be loved. Of what value, then, is he who abbreviates the details of those matters of which he professes to render a complete account, while he leaves behind the chief part of the things of which the whole is composed? It is true that impatience, the mother of stupidity, praises brevity, as if such persons had not life long enough to enable them to acquire a complete knowledge of one subject such as the human body, and then they seek to comprehend the mind of God, in which the universe is included, weighing it and splitting it into infinite particles, as if they had to dissect it. O human folly! Dost thou not perceive that thou hast been with thyself all thy life, and thou art not yet aware of the thing which more fully than any other thing thou dost possess, namely, thy own folly? And thou desirest, with the multitude of sophists, to deceive thyself and others, despising the mathematical sciences in which truth dwells and the knowledge of the things which they contain. And then thou dost busy thyself with miracles, and writest that thou hast attained to the knowledge of those things which the human mind cannot comprehend, which cannot be proved by any instance in nature, and thou deemest that thou hast wrought a miracle in spoiling the work of some speculative mind. And thou perceivest not that thy error is the same as that of a man who strips a plant of the ornament of its branches covered with leaves, mingled with fragrant flowers and fruits. Just as Justinius did when he abridged the stories written by Trogus Pompeius, who had written elaborately the noble deeds of his forefathers, which were full of wonderful beauties of style, and thus he composed a barren work, worthy only of the impatient spirits who deem that they are wasting the time which they might usefully employ in studying the works of nature and mortal affairs. But let such men remain in company with the beasts, let dogs and other animals full of rapine be their courtiers, and let them be accompanied with these running over at their heels, and let the harmless animals follow, in which the season of the snows come to the houses begging alms, as from their master. Nature. Nature is full of infinite causes which are beyond the pale of experience. Nature, in creating first, gives size to the abode of the intellect, the skull, the head, and then to the abode of the vital spirit, the chest. Law of necessity. Necessity is the mistress and guide of nature. Necessity is the theme and inventress of nature, her curb and her eternal law. When anything is the cause of any other thing, and brings about by its movement any effect, the movement of the effect necessarily follows the movement of the cause. Of lightning in the clouds. O mighty and once living instrument of creative nature, unable to avail thyself of thy great strength, thou must needs abend in a life of tranquillity, and obey the law which God and time give to nature the mother. Ah! How often the frighted shoals of dolphins and great tunny fish were seen fleeing before thy inhuman wrath, whilst thou, fulminating with swift beating of wings and twisted tail, raised in the sea a sudden storm with buffeting and sinking of ships and tossing of waves, filling the naked shores with terrified and distracted fishes. The human eye. Since the eye is the window of the soul is always fearful of losing it, so much so that if a man is suddenly frightened by the motion or an object before him, he does not with his hands protect his heart, the source of all life, nor his head, where dwells the Lord of the senses, nor the organs of hearing, smell, and taste. But as soon as he feels fright, it does not suffice him to close the lids of his eyes, keeping them shut with all his might, but he instantly turns in the opposite direction, and, still not feeling secure, he covers his eyes with one hand, stretching out the other to ward off the danger in the direction in which he suspects it to lie. Nature again has ordained that the eye of man shall close of itself, so that remaining during his sleep without protection, it shall suffer no hurt. Universal law. Every object naturally seeks to maintain itself in itself. The part always tends to reunite with its whole in order to escape from its imperfection. The soul desires to remain with its body because without the organic instruments of that body, it can neither act nor feel. The lover is moved by the object he loves as the senses are by sensible things, and they unite and become one and the same. The work is the first thing which is born of this union. If the thing loved is base, the lover becomes base. When what is united is in harmony with that which receives it, delight, pleasure, and satisfaction ensue. When the lover is united to the beloved, he rests there. When the burden is laid down, it finds rest there. A natural action is accomplished in the briefest manner. Nature, variable and infinite. To such an extent does nature delight and abound in variety, that among her trees there is not one plant to be found which is exactly like another, and not only among the plants, but among the boughs, the leaves, and the fruits, you will not find one which is exactly similar to another. If nature had made one rule for the quality of limbs, the faces of men would resemble each other to such a degree that it would not be possible to distinguish one from the other. But she has varied the 5 features of the face in such a way that, although she has made an almost universal rule with regard to their size, she has not done so with regard to their quality, so that each one can be clearly distinguished from the other. It is an easy matter for him who knows man to arrive at universal knowledge, since all terrestrial animals are similar in regard to their structure, that is to say, in regard to the muscles and bones, and they do not vary save in height and thickness. Then there are the aquatic animals, and I will not persuade the painter that any rule can be made with regard to these because they are of infinite variety. So are the insects. The body of anything which is fed is continually dying and being reborn, since nourishment cannot enter save where the past nourishment is exhausted. And if it is exhausted, it no longer has life. And if you do not furnish it with nourishment equal to that which has been before, you will impair the health of the organism, and if you deprive it of this nourishment, life will be altogether destroyed. But if you supply it with so much as can be consumed in a day, then as much life will be restored as was consumed, like the light of the candle which is furnished to it by the fuel provided by the moisture of the candle. And this light, with most speedy succour, restores beneath what is consumed above as it dies in dusky smoke. And this death is continuous. Likewise, the continuity of the smoke is equal to the continuity of the fuel. And in the same moment the light dies and is born together with the movement of its fuel. Man and animals are in reality vehicles and conduits of food, tombs of animals, hostels of death, coverings that consume, deriving life by the death of others. Light. Look on light and consider its beauty. Shut your eyes and look again. That which you see was not there before, and that which was no longer is. Who is he who remakes it if the producer is continually dying? Anaxagoras. Everything proceeds from everything, and everything becomes everything, because that which exists in the elements is composed of those elements. End of section 2. Thoughts on Life, Part 3, Nature, Nature appears to have been the cruel stepmother rather than the mother of many animals, and in some cases not the stepmother, but the pitying mother. Why did nature not ordain that one animal should not live by the death of the other? Nature, being inconstant and taking pleasure in continually creating and making lives and forms, because she knows that her earthly materials are thereby augmented, is more willing and swift to create than time is to destroy, and so she has ordained that many animals shall feed on each other. And, as even thus her desire is not satisfied, she frequently sends forth certain poisonous and pestilential vapors upon the increasing multitude and congregation of animals, and especially upon men who increase to a great extent, because other animals do not feed on them, and since there is no cause, there would follow no effect. This earth, therefore, seeks to lose its animal life, desiring only continual reproduction, and as, by the logical demonstration you adduce, effects often resemble their causes. Animals are the image of the life of the world. Life's philosophy. Now you see that the hope and the desire of returning to one's former state is like the desire of the moth for the light, and the man who, with constant yearning and joyful expectancy, awaits the new spring and the new summer, and every new month and the new year, and thinks that what he longs for is ever too late in coming, and does not perceive that he is longing for his own destruction. But this desire is the quintessence, the spirit of the elements, which, finding itself captive in the soul of the human body, desires always to return to its giver. And I would have you know that this same desire is the quintessence which is inseparable from nature, and that man is the model of the world. And such is the supreme folly of man that he labors so as to labor no more, and life flies from him while he forever hopes to enjoy the goods which he has acquired at the price of great labor. The senses and the soul. The soul seems to dwell in the intellect, and the intellect appears to dwell in that part where all the senses meet, which is called the brain, and the brain does not pervade the whole body, as many have thought. On the contrary, it dwells entirely in one part, because if it were all in all and the same in every part, it would not have been necessary for the instruments of those senses to combine among themselves in one single spot, but rather it would have been sufficient for the eye to fulfill the function of its sensation on the surface without transmitting, by means of the optic nerves, the likeness of its vision to the brain, so that the soul, for the reason given above, might perceive it in the surface of the eye. Likewise, with regard to the sense of hearing, it would have been sufficient if the voice had sounded only in the porous cavity of the indurated bone which lies within the ear, without making any further transit from this bone to the brain, which is its destination and where it discourses with common judgment. The sense of smell, too, is likewise compelled by necessity to proceed to the intellect. The sense of touch passes through the nerves and is conveyed to the brain, and these nerves diverge with infinite ramification in the skin, which encloses the limbs of the body and the entrails. The nerves convey volition and sensation to the muscles, and these nerves and the tendons which lie between the muscles and the sinews give movement to them. The muscles and sinews obey, and this obedience takes effect by the decrease of their thickness, for in swelling their length is reduced, and the tendons which are interwoven among the particles of the limbs shrink, and as they extend to the tips of the fingers, they transmit to the brain the cause of the sense of touch which they feel. The tendons, with their muscles, obey the nerves as soldiers obey their officers, and the nerves obey the brain as the officers obey their captain. Thus the joint of the bones obeys the tendon, and the tendons obey the muscles, and the muscles obey the nerves, and the nerves obey the brain, and the brain is the dwelling of the soul, and the memory is its ammunition, and the perception is its refundary. Of sensation. The brain is that which perceives what is transmitted to it by the other senses. The brain moves by means of that which is transmitted to it by the five senses. Motion is granted to the senses by objects, and these objects, transmitting their images to the five senses, are transferred by them to the perception, and by the perception to the brain, and there they are comprehended and committed to the memory, in which, according to their intensity, they are more or less firmly retained. The thinkers of ancient times concluded that the part of man which constitutes his intellect is caused by an instrument to which the other five senses refer everything by means of the perception, and this instrument they have named the common sense, or brain, and they say that this sense is situated in the center of the head. And they have given it this name, common sense, solely because it is the common judge of the other five senses, that is to say, sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. The common sense is stirred by means of the perception which is placed between it and the senses. The perception is stirred by means of the images of things conveyed to it by the external instruments to the senses, and these are placed in the center between the external things and the perception, and the senses likewise are stirred by objects. Surrounding objects transmit their images to the senses, and the senses transfer them to the perception, and the perception transfers them to the common sense, brain, and by it are stamped upon the memory, and are there retained in a greater or lesser degree according to the importance and intensity of the impression. The sense, which is most closely connected with the perception, is the most rapid in action, and this sense is the eye, the highest and chief of the others. Of this sense alone we will treat, and we will leave the others in order not to unduly lengthen our matter. Automatic movements. Nature has ordained for man the ministering muscles which exercise the sinews, and by means of which the limbs can be moved according to the will and desire of the brain, like to officers distributed by a ruler over many provinces and towns, who represent their ruler in these places and obey his will. And this officer, who will in a single instance have most faithfully obeyed the orders he received from his master by word of mouth, will afterwards, in a similar way, of his own accord fulfill the wishes of his master. An example of this can be frequently seen in the fingers which learn to perform on an instrument the things which the intellect commands, and the lesson, once learnt, they will perform it without the aid of the intellect. And do not the muscles, which cause the legs to move, perform their duty without man being conscious of it? You will see palsied and shivering persons move, and their trembling limbs, such as their head and hands, quiver, without the permission of the soul, and the soul, though it expend all its might, cannot prevent these limbs from trembling. The same thing occurs in epilepsy, or when limbs are partially truncated, as in the case of tails of lizards. Intellect. It happens that our intellect is that which prompts the hand to create the features of figures in divine aspects until it finds satisfaction. And since the intellect is one of the tones of our soul, by means of the soul it composes the form of the body where it dwells, according to its volition. And when it has to reproduce a human body, it takes pleasure in repeating the body which it originally created, whence it follows that they who fall in love are prone to become enamored of what resembles them. Of the senses. There are four powers: memory, intellect, sensuality, and lust. The first two are intellectual, the others sensual. Of the five senses, sight, hearing, smell are with difficulty prevented. Touch and taste, not at all. Taste follows smell in the case of dogs and other greedy animals. Why does the eye perceive things more clearly in dreams than with the imagination when one is awake? Time. Although time is included among continuous quantities, being indivisible and immaterial, it does not altogether fall into the scope of geometry. by which it is divided into figures and bodies of infinite variety, which are seen to be continuous insomuch as they are visible and material. But it agrees only with its first principles, i.e., with the point and the line. The point in time may be compared to an instant, and the line to a length of a certain quantity of time. Just as the point is the beginning and end of a line, so is an instant the beginning and end of any given space of time, and just as a line is infinitely divisible, so can a given space of time be likewise divided, and as the divisions of the line are in proportion to each other, so likewise are the divisions of time. In 12 whole figures, the cosmography of the miniature world will be shown to you in the same manner as Ptolemy in his cosmography. And so I will divide it afterwards into limbs, as he divided the world into provinces. Then I will explain the function of the parts in every direction, and put before your eyes a description of the whole figure and substance of man as regards his movements by means of his limbs. And thus, if it please our great author, I will demonstrate the nature of man and his habits in the way I describe his form. On the human body. And thou, O man, who wilt gaze in this work of mine on the marvellous works of nature, if thou thinkest it would be an act of wickedness to destroy it, think how much more wicked it is to take the life of a man. And if this his structure appears to thee a miraculous work of art, remember that it is nothing in comparison with the soul which inhabits this structure. For verily, whatever it may be, it is divine. Let it, then, dwell in his work and at his good will, and let not thy rage nor malice destroy so great a thing as life, for he who does not value it does not deserve it. The experimental method. By these rules thou wilt be able to distinguish falsehood from truth, by means of which knowledge men aim at possible things with greater moderation. And do not veil thyself in ignorance, for the result of this would be that thou wouldst be ineffectual and fall into melancholy and despair. Of navigation below the waters. How, by the aid of a machine, many may remain for some time under water. And how and why I do not describe my method of remaining under water and of living long without food. And I do not publish nor divulge these things by reason of the evil nature of man, who would use them for assassinations at the bottom of the sea, and to destroy and sink ships, together with the men on board of them. And, notwithstanding, I will teach other things which are not dangerous. Of physiognomy. I will not dwell on false physiognomy and chiromancy, because there is no truth in them, and this is manifest because chimeras of this kind have no scientific foundation. It is true that the lineaments of the face partly reveal the character of men, their vices and temperaments, but in the face, A, the features which separate the cheeks from the lips and the nostrils and cavities of the eyes are strongly marked if they belong to cheerful and good-humored men, and if these are slightly marked, it denotes that the men to whom they belong are given to meditation. B. Those whose features stand out in great relief and depth are brutal and bad-tempered, and reason little. C. Those who have strongly marked lines between the eyebrows are bad-tempered. D. Those who have strongly marked lines on the forehead are men full of concealed or unconcealed bewailing. And we can reason thus about many features. But the hand? You will find that whole armies perished in the same hour by the sword, in which no two men had similar marks in their hands, and the same argument applies to a shipwreck. Of pain. nature has placed in the front part of man, as he moves, all those parts which, when struck, cause him to feel pain. And this is felt in the joints of the legs, the forehead, and the nose, and has been so devised for the preservation of man, because if such pain were not felt in these limbs, they would be destroyed by the many blows they receive. Why plants do not feel pain. While nature has ordained that animals should feel pain in order that the instruments which might be liable to be maimed or marred by motion may be preserved, plants do not come into collision with the objects which are before them, whence pain is not a necessity for them, and therefore when they are broken they do not feel pain as animals do. Lust is the cause of generation. Appetite is the support of life. Fear or timidity is the prolongation of life. Pain is the preserver of the instrument of the human frame. Fear. Just as courage is the danger of life, so fear is its safeguard. Body and soul. Let him who wishes to see how the soul inhabits its body observe what use the body makes of its daily habitation. That is to say, if the soul is full of confusion and disorder, the body will be kept in disorder and confusion by the soul. The soul can never be corrupted with the corruption of the body, but it is like the wind which causes the sound of the organ, and which ceases to produce a good effect when a pipe is spoilt. End of section 3. Thoughts on Life, Part 4. Memory. Every loss which we incur leaves behind it vexation in the memory, save the greatest loss of all, that is, death, which annihilates the memory, together with life. Spirit. Our body is subject to heaven, and heaven is subject to the spirit. Sense and reason. The senses are earthly. Reason lies outside them when in contemplation. Where most feeling exists, there amongst martyrs is the greatest martyr. That which can be lost cannot be deemed riches. Virtue is our true wealth and the true reward of its possessor. It cannot be lost. It never deserts us until life leaves us. Hold property and external riches with fear. They often leave their possessor scorned and mocked at for having lost them. Flight of time. Men wrongly lament the flight of time, blaming it for being too swift. They do not perceive that its passage is sufficiently long, but a good memory, which nature has given to us, causes things long past to seem present. Illusions. Our intellect does not judge events which happened at various intervals of time in their true proportion, because many things which happened years ago appear recent and close to the present, and often recent things appear old and seem to belong to our past childhood. The eye does likewise with regard to distant objects in which the light of the sun appear to be close to the eye, and many objects which are close appear to be remote. Let us not lack ways and means of dividing and measuring these our wretched days, which we ought to take pleasure in spending and living not vainly and not without praise, nor without leaving any memory in the minds of men, so that this our miserable existence may not be spent in vain. Virtuous life. The age which flies glides by in stealth and deceives others. And nothing is more swift than the years, and he who sows virtue reaps glory. Sleep and death. O sleeper, what is sleep? Sleep is like unto death. Why dost thou not work in such wise that after death thou mayest have the semblance of perfect life, just as during life thou hast in thy sleep the semblance of the hapless dead? The water you touch in a river is the last of that which has gone, and the first of that which is coming. So it is with time present. A long life is a life well spent. Life. As a well-spent day affords happy sleep, so does a life profitably employed afford a happy death. Time the destroyer. O time, consumer of things, O envious age, thou dost destroy all things and consumest all things with the hard teeth of old age, little by little in a slow death. Helen, when she looked in her mirror and saw the withered wrinkles made in her face by old age, wept and wondered why she had twice been ravished. O time, devourer of things, O envious age, by which all is consumed. On fault finders. There exists among the foolish a certain sect of hypocrites who continually seek to deceive themselves and others, but others more than themselves, though in reality they deceive themselves more than others. And these are they who blame the painters who study on feast days the things which relate to the true knowledge of the forms of the works of nature, and sedulously strive to acquire knowledge of these things to the best of their ability. But such fault-finders pass over in silence the fact that this is the true manner of knowing the artificer of such great and marvelous things, and that this is the true way in which to love so great an inventor. For great love proceeds from the perfect knowledge of the thing loved, and if you do not know it, you can love it but little or not at all. And if you love it for the gain which you anticipate obtaining from it, and not for its supreme virtue, you are like the dog which wags its tail and shows signs of joy, leaping towards him who can give him a bone. But if you knew the virtue of a man, you would love him more, if that virtue was in its place. Prayer. I obey thee, Lord, first for the love which in reason I ought to bear thee, secondly because thou hast the power to shorten or prolong the lives of men. Thou, O God, dost sell us all good things at the price of labor. And many make a trade, deceiving the foolish multitude, and if no one comes to unmask their deceits, they punish it. Pharisees, that is to say, holy friars. Nothing can be written by means of new researches. Patience. Patience serves against insults as clothes do against the cold, since if you multiply your clothes as the cold increases, the cold cannot hurt you. Similarly, let thy patience increase under great offenses, and they will not be able to hurt your feelings. Advice to a speaker. Words which do not satisfy the ear of the listener will always weary or annoy him, and you will often see signs of this in such listeners in their frequent yawns. Therefore, you who speak before men whose good opinion you seek, when you observe such signs of vexation, shorten your speech or vary your argument, and if you do otherwise, then instead of the favor you seek, you will incur hate and hostility. And if you would see what gives pleasure to a man, speak to him on various themes, and when you see him intent, without yawning, or contracting his brow, or performing other actions, then be certain that the matter of which you are speaking is such as affords him pleasure. Advice. Here is a thing which the more it is needed, the more it is rejected, and this is advice, which is unwillingly heeded by those who most need it, that is to say, by the ignorant. Here is a thing which, the more you fear and avoid it, the nearer you approach to it. And this is misery. The more you flee from it, the more miserable and restless you will become. When the work comes up to the standard of the judgment, this is a bad sign for the judgment. And when the work excels the standard of the judgment, this is the worst sign, as occurs when a man marvels at having worked so well, and when the standard of the judgment exceeds that fulfilled by the work. This is a sign of perfection. And if the man is young and be thus disposed, he will without doubt grow into an excellent workman. He will only accomplish few works, but they will be of a quality which will compel men to contemplate their perfection with admiration. Proverbs. Nothing should be so greatly feared as empty fame. This empty fame issues from vices. A broken vase of clay can be remodeled, but this is no longer possible when it has been baked. A vow is born when hope dies. The beautiful is not always the good, and the fine talkers labor under this error without any reason. He who wishes to grow rich in a day will be hanged in a year. The memory of benefits is a frail defense against ingratitude. Reprove your friend in secret and praise him in public. He who fears dangers will not perish by them. The evil which does me no harm is like the good which in no wise avails me. He who offends others is not himself secure. Be not false about the past. Folly is the shield of lies, just as unreadiness is the defense of poverty. Where there is liberty, there is no rule. Here is a thing which the more it is heeded, the more it is spurned: advice. It is ill to praise, and worse to blame, the thing which you do not understand. On Mount Etna, the words freeze in your mouth, and you make ice of them. Threats are the only weapons of the threatened man. Ask advice of him who governs himself well. Justice needs power, intelligence, and will, and is like the queen bee. Not to punish evil is equivalent to authorizing it. He who takes the snake by the tail will be bitten by it. The pit will fall upon him who digs it. He who does not restrain voluptuousness is in the category of the beasts. You can have no dominion greater or less than that over yourself. He who thinks little errs much. It is easier to contend at the first than at the last. No counsel is more sincere than that given on ships which are in danger. Let him who acts on the advice of the young expect loss. You grow in reputation like bread in the hands of a child. Cannot beauty and utility be combined, as appears in citadels and men? He who is without fear often incurs great losses, and is often full of regret. If you governed your body according to virtue, you would not live in this world. Where good fortune enters, envy lays siege to her and attacks her, and when she departs, sorrow and regret remain behind. When beauty exists side by side with ugliness, the one seems more powerful, owing to the presence of the other. He who walks straight rarely falls. O miserable race of man, of how many things you make yourself the slave for the sake of money. The worst evil which can befall the artist is that his work should appear good in his own eyes. To speak well of a bad man is the same of speaking ill of a good man. Truth ordains that lying tongues shall be punished by the lie. He who does not value life does not deserve it. The beautiful works of mortals pass and do not endure. Labor flies with fame almost hidden in its arm. The gold in ingots is refined in the fire. The shuttle says, I will continue to move until the cloth is woven. everything that is crooked is straightened. A great ruin proceeds from a slight cause. Fine gold is recognized when it is tested. The image will correspond to the die. The wall will fall on him who scrapes it. Ivy lives long. To the traitor, death is life, because if he makes use of others, he is no longer believed. When fortune comes, seize her in front firmly, because behind she is bald. Constancy means not he who begins, but he who perseveres. I do not yield to obstacles. Every obstacle is overcome by resolve. He who is chained to a star does not change. Truth. Fire destroys falsehood, that is to say, sophistry, and rehabilitates truth, scattering the darkness. Fire must be represented as the consumer of all sophistry and the revealer of truth, because it is light that scatters darkness which conceals all essences. Fire destroys all sophistry, that is to say, deceit, and preserves truth alone, which is gold. Truth cannot be concealed in the end. Dissimulation is of no avail. Dissimulation is frustrated before so great a judge. Falsehood puts on a mask. There is nothing hidden under the sun. Fire must represent truth because it destroys all sophistry and lies, and the mask is for sophistry and lies, which conceal truth. Rather privation of limbs than weariness of doing good. The power of using my limbs shall fail me before the power of being useful. Rather death than weariness. I cannot be satiated with serving. I do not weary of giving help. No amount of work is sufficient to weary me. This is a carnival motto. Sine lassitudine. Hands in which ducats and precious stones abound like snow never grow weary of serving, but such a service is for its utility only and not for our profit. Nature has formed me thus. Ingratitude. This shall be placed in the hand of ingratitude. The wood nourishes the fire that consumes it. When the sun, the scatterer of darkness, shines, you put out the light, which, for you in particular, and for your need and convenience, expelled the darkness. Physiological inferiority of man. I have found that in the composition of the human body as compared with the bodies of animals, the senses are less subtle and coarser. It is thus composed of less ingenious machinery and of cells less capable of receiving the power of senses. I have seen that in the lion the sense of smell is connected with the substance of the brain and descends through the nostrils, which form an ample receptacle for it, and it enters into a great number of cartilaginous cells, which are provided with many passages in order to receive the brain. A large part of the head of the lion is given up to the sockets of the eyes, and the optic nerves are in immediate contact with the brain. The contrary occurs in man because the sockets of the eyes occupy a small portion of the head, and the optic nerves are subtle and long and weak, and owing to the weakness of their action, we see little by day and less at night, and the animals above mentioned see better at night than in the daytime, and the proof of this is that they seek their prey at night and sleep during the daytime, as do also the nocturnal birds. Man's ethical inferiority. Thou hast described him king of animals, but I would rather say king of beasts, thou being the greatest. For hast thou not slain them, in order that they may give thee their children to glut thy greed, with which thou hast striven to make a sepulchre for all animals? And I would say still more, if I might speak the whole truth. But let us confine ourselves to human matters, relating one supreme infamy, which is not to be found among the animals of the earth, because among these you will not find animals who eat their young, except when they are utterly foolish, and there are few indeed of such among them. And this occurs only among the beasts of prey, such as the lions and leopards, panthers, lynxes, cats, and the like, which sometimes feed on their young. But thou, besides thy children, dost devour thy father, thy mother, thy brother, and thy friends, and not satisfied with this, thou goest forth to hunt on the islands of others, seizing other men, and of these half naked thou fattenest and chasest them down thy own throat. Now, does not nature produce enough vegetables for thee to satisfy thyself? And if thou art not content with vegetables, canst thou not, by a mixture of them, make infinite compounds, as Platina wrote, and other writers on food? End of section 4. Thoughts on Life, Part 5. Man in the Animal World. The description of man, including that of such creatures belonging almost to the same species, such as apes, monkeys, and the like, of which there are many. The way of walking in man is similar in all cases to the universal way of walking in four-footed animals, because, just as they move their feet crosswise, like a trotting horse, so man moves his four limbs crosswise. That is to say, in walking he puts forward his right foot simultaneously with his left arm, and so on vice versa. Write a special treatise to describe the movements of four-footed animals, among which is man, who in his childhood also walks on 4 feet. Fragment of a letter. There is one who, having promised me much less than his due, and being disappointed of his presumptuous desire, has tried to deprive me of all of my friends, and finding them wise and not pliable to his will, he has threatened me that he would bring accusations against me and alienate my benefactors from me. Hence I have informed your lordship of this, so that this man who wishes to sow the usual scandals may not find a soil fit for sowing the thoughts and deeds of his evil nature, and that when he tries to make your lordship the tool of his infamous and malicious nature, he may be disappointed of his desire. Giacomo, of pupil of Leonardo. On the 23rd of April, 1490, I began this book, and started again on the horse. Giacomo came to live with me on St. Mary Magdalene's Day in 1490. He was 10 years old. He was a thief, a liar, obstinate, and a glutton. On the second day I had 2 shirts made for him, a pair of socks, and a jerkin, and when I placed the money aside to pay for these things, he stole it out of the purse, and I could never force him to confess the fact, though I was quite certain of it. 4 lire. On the following day I went to sup with Giacomo Andrea, and this same Giacomo supped for 2 and did mischief for 4, since he broke 3 bottles, spilled the wine, and after this came to sup where I. Item, on the 7th of September he stole a silver point, worth 12 soldi, from Marco, who was living with me, and took it from his studio, and when Marco had looked for it for some time, he found it hidden in Giacomo's box. Lira 1, soldi 2. Item. On the 26th of the following January, being in the house of Messer Galeazzo di San Severino, in order to arrange the festivity of his joust, and certain henchmen having undressed to try on the costumes of rustics who were to take part in aforesaid festivity, Giacomo took the purse of one of them, which was on the bed with other clothes, and stole the money he found in it, 2 lire 4 soldi. Item. Maestro Agostino of Padua gave me, while I was in the same house, a Turkish hide to have a pair of shoes made of it, and Giacomo stole this from me within a month and sold it to a cobbler for 20 soldi, with which money, by his own confession, he bought sweets of aniseed. Item. Again, on the 2nd of April, Giovanni Antonio left a silver point on one of his drawings, and Giacomo stole it. It was worth 24 soldi. 1 lira 4 soldi. The first year a cloak, 2 lira. 6 shirts, 4 lire. 3 doublets, 6 lire. 4 pairs of socks, 7 lire, 8 soldi. And in this case I know that I shall make not a few enemies, since no one will believe what I say of him, because there are but few whom his vices have disgusted. Indeed, they only disgusted those men whose natures are contrary to such vices. And many hate their fathers, and break off friendship with those who reprove their vices, and they will have no examples brought up against them, nor tolerate any advice. And if you meet with any one who is good and virtuous, drive him not away from you, do him honor, so that he may not have to flee from you and hide in hermitages, or caverns and other solitary spots, in order to escape from your treachery. And if there be such a one, do him honor, because these are your gods upon earth. They deserve statues from you and images. But remember that you are not to eat their images, as it is practiced still in some parts of India, where, when images have performed some miracle, the priests cut them in pieces, since they are made of wood, and distribute them among the people of the country, not without payment, and each one grates his portion very fine and puts it upon the first food he eats, and thus they believe that they have eaten their saint by faith, who will preserve them from all perils. What is thy opinion, O man, of thy own species? Art thou so wise as thou believest to be? Are these things to be done by men? Pleasure and pain. This represents pleasure together with pain, because one is never separated from the other. They are depicted back to back because they are opposed to each other. They are represented in one body because they have the same basis, because the source of pleasure is labor mingled with pain, and the pain issues from the various evil pleasures. And it is therefore represented with a reed in its right hand, which is ineffectual and devoid of strength, and the wounds inflicted by it are poisonous. In Tuscany, such reeds are placed to support beds, to signify that this is the place of idle dreams, that here a great part of life is consumed. Here much useful time is wasted, that is, the morning hours when the mind is sober and rested and the body disposed to start on fresh labors. There, again, many vain pleasures are enjoyed by the mind, which pictures to itself impossible things, and by the body, which indulges in those pleasures that are so often the case of the failing of life, and for this reason the reed is used as their support. Brain and soul. The spirit returns to the brain whence it had departed, with a loud voice, and uttering these words: O blissful and fortunate spirit, whence comest thou? I have known this man well against my will. He is a receptacle of villainy. He is a very heap of the highest ingratitude combined with all the other vices. But why should I tire myself with vain words? Nothing is to be found in him save the accumulation of all sins, and if there is to be found among them any that possess good, they will not be treated differently than I have been by other men. In short, I have come to the conclusion that they are bad if they are enemies, and worse if they are friends. Of the eye. The eye, which reflects the beauty of the universe to those who see, is so excellent a thing that he who consents to its loss deprives himself of the spectacle of the works of nature. And it is owing to this spectacle, effected by means of the eye, which enables the soul to behold the various objects of nature, that the soul is content to remain in the prison of the body. But he who loses his eyesight leaves the soul in a dark prison, where all hope of once more beholding the sun, the light of the whole world, is lost. And how many are they who feel great hatred for the darkness of night, although it is brief? Oh, what would they do were they constrained to abide in this darkness during the whole of their life? Certainly there is no one who would not rather lose his hearing or sense of smell than his eyesight, and the loss of hearing includes the loss of all sciences which find expression in words. and this loss a man would incur solely so as not to be deprived of the sight of the beauty of the world, which consists in the surfaces of bodies artificial as well as natural, which are reflected in the human eye. The eye in animal life. Animals suffer greater loss in losing their sight than their hearing for many reasons. Firstly, because it is by means of their sight that they find the food which is their nourishment, and is necessary for all animals. Secondly, because by means of sight the beauty of created things is apprehended, especially those which lead to love, while he who is born blind cannot apprehend such beauty by hearing, because he has never received any knowledge as to what is beauty of any kind. There remains hearing, by which I mean only the human voice and speech. They contain the names of all things whatsoever. It is possible to live happily without the knowledge of these words. It is as seen in those who are born deaf, that is to say, the dumb, who take delight in drawing. Ascension of Monte Rosa. I say that the azure we see in the atmosphere is not its true color, but is caused by warm moisture evaporated in minute and insensible atoms which the solar rays strike, rendering them luminous against the darkness of the infinite night of the fiery region which lies beyond and includes them. And this may be seen, as I saw it, by him who ascends Mount Bosso, Monte Rosa, a peak of the Alps which separates France from Italy. The base of this mountain gives birth to the 4 large rivers, which in 4 different directions water the whole of Europe, and no mountain has its base at so great a height as this. It rises to such a height that it almost lifts itself up above the clouds. Snow seldom falls on it, but only hail in summer, when the clouds are at their greatest height, and this hail is preserved there, so that were it not for the absorption of the rising and falling clouds, which does not occur twice in an age, a great quantity of ice would be piled up there by the hail, which, in the middle of July, I found to be very considerable. And I saw above me the dark air, and the sun which struck the mountain shone far lighter than in the plains below, because a lesser quantity of atmosphere lay between the summit of the mountain and the sun. Prophecies. Men will communicate with each other from the most distant countries, and reply. Many will abandon their own habitations and take with them their own goods, and go and inhabit other countries. Men will pursue the thing which they most greatly fear, that is to say, they will be miserable in order to avoid falling into misery. Men, standing in separate hemispheres, will converse with each other, embrace each other, and understand each other's language. We should not desire the impossible. End of section 5.
Thoughts on Art, Part 1. Painting declines when aloof from nature. The painter's work will be of little merit if he takes the painting of others as his standard. But if he studies from nature, he will produce good fruits, as is seen in the case of the painters of the age after the Romans, who continued to imitate one another, and whose art consequently declined from age to age. After these came Giotto the Florentine, who was born in the lonely mountains, inhabited only by goats and similar animals. And he, being drawn to his art by nature, began to draw on the rocks the doings of the goats of which he was the keeper. And thus he likewise began to draw all the animals which he met within the country, so that after long study he surpassed not only all the masters of his age, but all those of many past centuries. After him art relapsed once more, because all artists imitated the painted pictures, and thus from century to century it went on declining, until Tommaso the Florentine, called Masaccio, proved by his perfect work that they who set up for themselves a standard other than nature, the mistress of all masters, labor in vain. Thus I wish to say in regard to these mathematical matters, that they who merely study the masters and not the works of nature are the grandchildren and not the children of nature, the mistress of good masters. I abhor the supreme folly of those who blame the disciples of nature in defiance of those masters who were themselves her pupils. Its origin. The first picture was a single line, drawn round the shadow of a man cast by the sun on the wall. Vastness of the field of painting. All that is visible is included in the science of painting. Defense of painting. With due lamentation, painting complains that it has been expelled from the liberal arts, because it is the true daughter of nature, and is practiced by means of the most worthy of the senses. Whence wrongly, O writers, you have excluded painting from the liberal arts, since it not only includes in its range the works of nature, but also infinite things which nature never created. Because writers have had no knowledge of the science of painting, they have not been able to describe its gradations and parts, and since painting itself does not reveal itself nor its artistic work in words, it has remained, owing to ignorance, behind the sciences mentioned above, but it has thereby lost nothing of its divinity. And truly it is not without reason that men have failed to honor it, because it does honor to itself without the aid of the speech of others, just as do the excellent works of nature. And if the painters have not described the art of painting, and reduced it to a silence, the fault must not be imputed to painting. And it is no less noble on that account, since few painters profess a knowledge of letters, as their life would not be long enough for them to acquire such knowledge. Therefore, we ask, is the virtue of herbs, stones, and plants non-existent, because men have been ignorant of it? Certainly not. But we will say that these herbs remain noble in themselves without the aid of human tongues or letters. Painting. A science is more useful in proportion as its fruits are more widely understood, and thus, on the other hand, it is less useful in proportion as it is less widely understood. The fruits of painting can be apprehended by all the populations of the universe, because its results are subject to the power of sight, and it does not pass by the ear to the brain, but by the same channel by which sight passes. Therefore it needs no interpreters of diverse tongues, as letters do, and it has instantly satisfied the human race in the same manner as the works of nature have done. And not only the human race, but other animals, as was shown in a picture representing the father of a family to whom little children still in the cradle gave caresses, as did the dog and the cat in the same house. And it was a wonderful thing to see such a sight. The arts which admit of exact reproduction are such that the disciple is on the same level as the creator, and so it is with their fruits. These are useful to the imitator, but are not of such high excellence as those which cannot be transmitted as an inheritance, like other substances. Among these, painting is the first. Painting cannot be taught to him on whom nature has not conferred the gift of receiving such knowledge, as mathematics can be taught, of which the disciple receives as much as the master gives him. It cannot be copied, as letters can be, in which the copy equals the original. It cannot be stamped in the same way as sculpture, in which the impression is in proportion to the source as regards the quality of the work. It does not generate countless children, as do printed books. It alone remains noble. It alone confers honor on its author, and remains precious and unique, and does not beget children equal to itself. And it is more excellent by reason of this quality than by reason of those which are everywhere proclaimed. Now do we not see the great monarchs of the East going about veiled and covered up from the fear of diminishing their glory by manifestation and by the divulgation of their presence? And do we not see that the pictures which represent the divine deity are kept covered up with inestimable veils? Their unveiling is preceded by great sacred solemnities, with various chants and diverse music. And when they are unveiled, the vast multitude of people who are there flocked together immediately prostrate themselves and worship and invoke those whom such pictures represent, that they may regain their lost holiness and win eternal salvation, just as if the deity were present in the flesh. This does not occur in any other art or work of man. And if you say that is owing to the nature of the subject depicted rather than to the genius of the painter, the answer is that the mind of man could satisfy itself equally well in this case, were the man to remain in bed and not make pilgrimages to places which are perilous and hard of access, as we so often see is the case. But if such pilgrimages continually exist, what is then their unnecessary cause? You will certainly admit that it is an image of this kind, and all the writings in the world could not succeed in representing the semblance and power of such a deity. Therefore it appears that this deity takes pleasure in the pictures, and is pleased that it should be loved and revered, and takes a greater delight in being worshipped in that rather than in any other semblance of itself. And by reason of this it bestows grace and gifts of salvation according to the belief of those who meet together in such a place. Painting excels all the works of man. The eye, which is called the window of the soul, is the principal means by which the brain can most abundantly and splendidly contemplate the infinite works of nature, and the ear is the next in order, which is ennobled by hearing the recital of the things seen by the eye. If you, historians and poets, or mathematicians, had not seen things with the eyes, you could not report of them in writing. If thou, O poet, dost tell a story with thy painting pen, the painter will more easily give satisfaction in telling it with his brush, and in a manner less tedious and more easily understood. And if thou callest painting mute poetry, the painter can call poetry blind painting. Now consider which is the greater loss, to be blind or dumb. Though the poet is as free as the painter in his creations and compositions, they are not so satisfactory to men as paintings, because if poetry is able to describe forms, actions, and places in words, the painter deals with the very semblance of forms in order to represent them. Now consider which is nearer to man, the name of man or the image of man. The name of man varies in diverse countries, but death alone changes his form. If thou wast to say that painting is more lasting, I answer that the works of a coppersmith, which time preserves longer than thine or ours, are more eternal still. Nevertheless, there is but little invention in it, and painting on copper with colors of enamel is far more lasting. We, by our art, can be called the grandsons of God. If poetry deals with moral philosophy, painting deals with natural philosophy. If poetry describes the action of the contemplative mind, painting represents the effect in motion of the action of the mind. If poetry terrifies people with the pictures of hell, painting does the same by depicting the same things in action. If a poet challenges the painter to represent beauty, fierceness, or an evil, an ugly, or a monstrous thing, whatever variety of forms he may produce in his way, the painter will cause greater satisfaction. Are there not pictures to be seen so like reality that they deceive men and animals? Painting creates reality. The imagination is to the effect as the shadow to the opaque body which causes the shadow, and the proportion is the same between poetry and painting. Because poetry produces its results in the imagination of the reader, and painting produces them in a concrete reality outside the eye, so that the eye receives its images just as if they were the works of nature, and poetry produces its results without images, and they do not pass to the brain through the channel of the visual faculty, as in painting. Painting represents to the brain the works of nature with greater truth and accuracy than speech or writing. But letters represent words with greater truth, which painting does not do. But we say that the science which represents the works of nature is more wonderful than that which represents the works of the artificer, that is to say, the works of man, which consist of words, such as poetry and the like, which issue from the tongue of man. The painter goes to nature. Painting ministers to a nobler sense than poetry, depicts the forms of the works of nature with greater truth than poetry, and the works of nature are nobler than the words which are the works of man, because there is the same proportion between the works of man and those of nature as there is between man and God. Therefore, it is a more worthy thing to imitate the works of nature, which are the true images embodied in reality, than to imitate the actions and the words of men. And if thou, O poet, wishest to describe the works of nature by thine unaided art, and dost represent various places and the forms of diverse objects, the painter surpasses thee by an infinite degree of power. But if thou wishest to have recourse to the aid of other sciences, apart from poetry, they are not thy own. For instance, astrology, rhetoric, theology, philosophy, geometry, arithmetic, and the like. Thou art not then a poet any longer. Thou transformest thyself and art no longer that of which we are speaking. Now seest thou not that if thou wishest to go to nature, thou reachest her by the means of science, deduced by others from the effects of nature? And the painter through himself alone, without the aid of aught appertaining to the various sciences, or by any other means, achieves directly the imitation of the things of nature. By painting, lovers are attracted to the images of the beloved to converse with the depicted semblance. By painting, whole populations are led with fervent vows to seek the image of the deities, and not to see the books of poets which represent the same deities in speech. By painting, animals are deceived. I once saw a picture which deceived a dog by the image of its master, which the dog greeted with great joy, and likewise I have seen dogs bark at and try to bite painted dogs, and a monkey make a number of antics in front of a painted monkey. I have seen swallows fly and alight on painted ironworks which jut out of the windows of buildings. Superiority of painting to philosophy. Painting includes in its range the surface, color, and shape of anything created by nature, and philosophy penetrates into the same bodies and takes notes of their essential virtue, but it is not satisfied with that truth, as is the painter, who seizes hold of the primary truth of such bodies because the eye is less prone to deception. Painting and poetry. Poetry surpasses painting in the representation of words, and in the representation of actions painting excels poetry. And painting is to poetry as actions are to words, because actions depend on the eye and words on the ear. And thus the senses are in the same proportion one to another as the objects on which they depend. And on this account I consider painting to be superior to poetry. But since those who practice painting were for long ignorant as to how to explain its theory, it lacked advocates for a considerable time, because it does not speak itself, but reveals itself and ends in action, and poetry ends in words, which in its vainglory it employs for self-praise. End of section 6. Thoughts on Art, Part 2. Painting is mute poetry. What poet will place before thee in words, O lover, the true semblance of thy idea with such truth as will the painter? Who is he who will show thee rivers, woods, valleys, and plains, which will recall to thee the pleasures of the past with greater truth than the painter. And if thou sayest that painting is mute poetry in itself, unless there be some one to speak for it and tell what it represents, seest thou not then that thy book is on a lower plane? Because even if it have a man to speak for it, nothing of the subject which is related can be seen, as it is seen when a picture is explained. And the pictures, if action represented and the mental attributes of the figures are in the true proportion one to another, will be understood in the same way as if they spoke. Painting is mute poetry, and poetry is blind painting. Therefore, these two forms of poetry, or rather these two forms of painting, have exchanged the senses through which they should reach the intellect. Because if they are both of them painting, they must reach the brain by the noblest sense, namely the eye. If they are both of them poetry, they must reach the brain by the less noble sense, that is, the hearing. Therefore, we will appoint the man born deaf to be the judge of painting, and the man born blind to be the judge of poetry. And if in the painting the movements are appropriate to the mental attributes of the figures which are engaged in any kind of action, there is no doubt that the deaf man will understand the action and the intentions of the figures, but the blind man will never understand what the poet shows, and what constitutes the glory of the poetry, since one of the noblest functions of its art is to describe the deeds and the subjects of stories, and adorned in delectable places with transparent waters in which the green recesses of their course can be seen as the waves disport themselves over meadows and fine pebbles, and the plants which are mingled with them, and the gliding fishes and similar descriptions, which might just as well be made to a stone as to a man born blind, since he has never seen that which composes the beauty of the world, that is, light, darkness, color, body, shape, place, distance, propinquity, motion, and rest, which are the 10 ornaments of nature. But the deaf man, lacking the less noble sense, although he has at the same time lost the gift of speech, since, never having heard words spoken, he has never been able to learn any language, will nevertheless perfectly understand every attribute of the human body better than a man who can speak and hear, and likewise he will know the works of painters and what is represented in them, and the action which is appropriate to such figures. Painting is mute poetry. Painting is mute poetry, and poetry is blind painting, and both imitate nature to the best of their powers, and both can demonstrate moral principles, as Apelles did in his calumny. And since painting ministers to the most noble of the senses, the eye, a harmonious proportion ensues from it, that is to say, that just as from the concord of many diverse voices at the same moment, there ensues a well-proportioned harmony, which will please the sense of hearing to such an extent that the listeners in dizzy admiration are like men half ravished of their senses. Still greater will be the effect of the beautiful proportions of a celestial face in a picture from whose proportions a harmonious concord will ensue, which delights the eye in one moment, just as music delights the ear. And if this harmonious beauty is shown to one who is the lover of the woman from whom such great beauty has been copied, he will most certainly be struck dizzy with admiration, and incomparable joy superior to that afforded by all the other senses. But with regard to poetry, which in order to afford the representation of a perfect beauty is obliged to describe each separate part in detail, a representation which in painting produces the harmony described above, no further charm is produced than would occur in music if each voice were to be heard separately at various intervals of time, whence no concord would ensue, just as if we wished to show a countenance bit by bit, always covering up the parts already shown, forgetfulness would prevent the production of any harmonious concord, since the eye could not apprehend the parts with its visual faculty at the same moment. The same thing occurs in the beauty of any object created by the poet. For as its parts are related separately, at separate times, the memory receives no harmony from it. The impression of painting. Painting reveals itself immediately to thee with the semblance given it by its creator, and affords to the chief of the senses as great a delight as any object created by nature. And the poet in this case reveals the same objects to the brain by the channel of the hearing, the inferior sense, and affords the eye no more pleasure than it derives from anything which is related. Now consider what a difference there is between hearing the recital of a thing which in the course of time gives pleasure to the eye, and perceiving it with the same velocity with which we apprehend the works of nature. And in addition to the fact that a long interval of time is necessary to read the works of the poets, it often occurs that they are not understood, and it is necessary to make diverse comments on them, and it is exceedingly rare that the commentators are agreed as to the meaning of the poet. And often the readers peruse but a small portion of their works, owing to lack of time, but the works of the painter are immediately understood by those who behold them. Painting manifests its essence to thee in an instant of time, its essence by the visual faculty, the very means by which the perception apprehends natural objects, and in the same duration of time. And in this space of time the sense-satisfying harmony of the proportion of the parts composing the whole is formed. And poetry apprehends the same things, but by a sense inferior to that of the eyesight, which bears the images of the objects named to the perception with greater confusion and less speed. Not in such wise acts the eye, the true intermediary between the object and the perception, for it immediately communicates the true semblance and image of what is represented before it with the greatest accuracy. Whence that proportion arises called harmony, which with sweet concord delights the sense in the same way as the harmony of diverse voices delights the ear. And this harmony is less worthy than that which delights the eye, because for every part of it that is born a part dies, and it dies as fast as it is born. This cannot occur in the case of the eye, because if thou presentest a beautiful living mortal to the eye, composed of a harmony of fair limbs, its beauty is not so transient nor so quickly destroyed as that of music. On the contrary, it has permanent duration, and allows thee to behold and consider it, and is not reborn as in the case of music, which is played many times over. Nor will it weary thee. On the contrary, thou becomes enamored with it, and the result it produces is that all the senses, together with the eye, would wish to possess it, and it seems that they would wish to compete with the eye. It appears that the mouth desires it for itself, if the mouth can be considered as a sense. The ear takes pleasure in hearing its beauty. The sense of touch would like to penetrate into all its pores. The nose also would like to receive the air it exhales. Time in a few years destroys this harmony, but this does not occur in the case of beauty depicted by the painter, because time preserves it for long, and the eye, as far as its function is concerned, receives as much pleasure from the depicted as from the living beauty. Touch alone is lacking to the painted beauty. Touch, which is the elder brother of sight, which after it has attained its purpose does not prevent the reason from considering the divine beauty. And in this case the picture copied from the living beauty acts for the greater part as a substitute, and the description of the poet cannot accomplish this. The poet, who is now set up as a rival to the painter, but does not perceive that time sets a division between the words in which he describes the various parts of the beauty, and that forgetfulness intervenes and divides the proportions which he cannot name without great prolixity. He cannot compose the harmonious concord which is formed of divine proportions. And on this account, beauty cannot be described in the same space of time in which a painted beauty can be seen, and it is a sin against nature to attempt to transmit by the ear that which should be transmitted by the eye. What prompts thee, O man, to abandon thy habitations in the city, to leave thy parents and friends, and to seek rural spots in the mountains and valleys, if it not be the natural beauty of the world, which, if thou reflectest, thou dost enjoy solely by means of the sense of sight? And if the poet wishes to be called a painter in this connection also, why didst thou not take the descriptions of places made by the poet, and remain at home without exposing thyself to the heat of the sun? Oh, would not this have been more profitable and less fatiguing to thee, since this can be done in the cool without motion and danger of illness? But the soul could not enjoy the benefit of the eyes, the windows of its dwelling, and it could not note the character of joyous places. It could not see the shady valleys watered by the sportiveness of the winding rivers. It could not see the various flowers, which with their colors make a harmony for the eye, and all the other objects which the eye can apprehend. But if the painter in the cold and rigorous season of winter can evoke for thee the landscapes, variegated and otherwise, in which thou didst experience thy happiness, if near some fountain thou canst see thyself, a lover with thy beloved, in the flowery fields under the soft shadow of the budding boughs, wilt thou not experience a greater pleasure than in hearing the same effect described by the poet? Here the poet answers, admitting these arguments. But he maintains that he surpasses the painter because he causes men to speak and reason in diverse fictions, in which he invents things that do not exist, and that he will incite men to take arms, and describe the heavens, the stars, nature, and the arts, and everything. To which we reply that none of these things of which he speaks is his true profession. But if he wishes to speak and make orations, it can be shown that he is surpassed by the orator in this province. And if he speaks of astrology, that he has stolen the subject of the astrologer, and in the case of philosophy, of the philosopher, and that in reality poetry has no true position, and merits no more consideration than a shopkeeper who collects goods made by various workmen. As soon as the poet ceases to represent by means of words the phenomena of nature, he then ceases to act as a painter, because if the poet leaves such representation and describes the flowery and persuasive speech of him to whom he wishes to give speech, he then becomes an orator and neither a poet nor a painter, and if he speaks of the heavens he becomes an astrologer and a philosopher and a theologian if he discourses of nature or God. But if he returns to the description of any object he would rival the painter, if with words he could satisfy the eye as the painter does. But the spirit of the science of painting deals with all works, human as well as divine, which are terminated by their surfaces, that is, the lines of the limits of bodies by means of which the sculptor is required to achieve perfection in his art. She, with her fundamental rules, i.e., drawing, teaches the architect how to work so that his building may be pleasant to the eye. She teaches the makers of diverse vases, the goldsmiths, weavers, embroiderers. She has found the characters with which diverse languages find expression. She has given symbols to the mathematicians. She has taught geometry its figures, and instructed the astrologers, the makers of machines and engineers. Poet and painter. The poet says that his science consists of invention and rhythm, and this is the simple body of poetry, invention as regards the subject matter, and rhythm as regards the verse, which he afterwards clothes with all the sciences. To which the painter rejoins that he is governed by the same necessities in the science of painting, that is to say, invention and measure, fancy as regards the subject matter which he must invent, and measure as regards the matters painted, so that they may be in proportion, but that he does not make use of three sciences. On the contrary, it is rather the other sciences that make use of painting, as for instance, astrology, which effects nothing without the aid of perspective, the principal link of painting. That is, mathematical astronomy and not fallacious astrology, Let those who by reason of the existence of fools make a profession of it forgive me. The poet says he describes an object, that he represents another full of beautiful allegory. The painter says he is capable of doing the same, and in this respect he is also a poet. And if the poet says he can incite men to love, which is the most important fact among every kind of animal, the painter can do the same, all the more so because he presents the lover with an image of his beloved, and the lover often does with it what he would not do with the writer's delineation of the same charms, i.e., talk with it and kiss it. So great is the painter's influence on the minds of men that he incites them to love and become enamored of a picture which does not represent any living woman. And if the poet pleases the sense by means of the ear, the painter does so by the eye, which is the superior sense. I will enlarge no further on this theme, save to say that if a good painter were to represent the fury of a battle, and if the poet were to describe one, and both representations were put before the public together, you will see before which of the two most of the spectators will stop, to which of the two they will pay most attention, which of the two will be the most praised, and give the greater satisfaction. Without any doubt, the painting, being infinitely the most beautiful and useful, will please the most. Write the name of God in some spot, and set up his image opposite, and you will see which one will be the most reverenced. While painting embraces in itself all the forms of nature, you have nothing save words, which are not universal like forms. If you have the effects of the representation, we have the representation of the effects. Take a poet who describes the charms of a woman to her lover, and a painter who represents her, and you will see whither nature leads the enamored critic. Certainly the proof should rest on the verdict of experience. You have classed painting among the mechanical arts, but, truly, if painters were as apt at praising their own works in writing as you are, it would not lie under the stigma of so unhonored a name. If you call it mechanical because it is by manual work, and that the hand represents the conception of the imagination, you writers put down with the pen the conceptions of your mind. And if you say that it is mechanical because it is done for money, who is more guilty of this error, if error it can be called, than you? If you lecture in the schools, do you not go to whomever rewards you most? Do you perform any work without some pay? Although I do not say this to blame such opinions, because all labor expects its reward, and if a poet were to say, I will devise with my fancy a work which shall be pregnant with meaning, the painter can do the same, as Apelles did when he painted the calumny. End of section 7. Section 8 of Thoughts on Art and Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claire Stewart. Thoughts on Art and Life by Leonardo da Vinci. Translated by Maurice Baring and edited by Louis Einstein. Thoughts on Art, Part 3. King Matthias and the Poet. On the birthday of King Matthias, a poet brought him a work made in praise of the royal birthday for the benefit of the world, and a painter presented him with a portrait of his lady love. The king immediately shut the book of the poet and turned to the picture, and remained gazing on it with profound admiration. Then the poet, greatly slighted, said, O king, read, read, and thou wilt hear something of far greater substance than a dumb picture. Then the king, hearing himself blamed for contemplating a mute object, said, O poet, be silent. Thou knowest not what thou sayest. This picture gratifies a nobler sense than thy work, which is for the blind. Give me an object which I can see and touch and not only hear, and blame not my choice in having placed thy work beneath my elbow, while I hold the work of the painter with both my hands before my eyes, because my very hands have chosen to serve a worthier sense than that of hearing. And as for myself, I consider that the same proportion exists between the art of the painter and that of the poet as that which exists between the two senses on which they respectively depend. Knowest thou not that our soul is composed of harmony, and harmony can only be begotten in the moments when the proportions of objects are simultaneously visible and audible? Seest thou not that in thine art there is no harmony created in a moment, and that, on the contrary, each part follows from the other in succession, and the second is not born before its predecessor dies? For this reason I consider thy creation to be considerably inferior to that of the painter, simply because no harmonious concord ensues from it. It does not satisfy the mind of the spectator or the listener as the harmony of the perfect features which compose the divine beauty of this face which is before me. For the features united altogether simultaneously afford me a pleasure which I consider to be unsurpassed by any other thing on the earth which is made by man. Value of the visible universe. There is no one so foolish who, if offered the choice between everlasting blindness and deafness, would not immediately elect to lose both his hearing and sense of smell rather than to be blind, since he who loses his sight is deprived of the beauty of the world and all created things, and the deaf man loses only the sound made by the percussion of the air, which is an insignificant thing in the world. Thou sayest that science increases in nobility in proportion as the subjects with which it deals are more elevated, and for this reason a false rendering of the being of God is better than the portrayal of a less worthy object. And on this account we will say that painting, which deals alone with the works of God, is worth more than poetry, which deals solely with the lying imaginings of human devices. Poet and painter. Thou sayest, O painter, that worship is paid to thy work, but impute not this power to thyself, but to the subject which such a picture represents. Here the painter makes answer: O thou poet, who sayest that thou also art an imitator, why dost thou not represent with thy words objects of such a nature that thy writings which contain these words may be worshipped also? But nature has favored the painter more than the poet, and it is fair that the works of the more greatly favored one should be more honored than those of the less favored one. Therefore let us praise him who with words satisfies the hearing, and him who by painting affords perfect content to the eyes. But let the praise given to the worker in words be less, inasmuch as they are accidental and created by a less worthy author than the works of nature of which the painter is the imitator. And the existence of these works is confined within the forms of their surfaces. Since we have concluded that the utmost extent of the comprehension of poetry is for the blind, and that of painting for the deaf, we will say that the value of painting exceeds that of poetry in proportion as painting gratifies a nobler sense than poetry does. And this nobility has been proved to be equal to that of 3 other senses, because we elect to lose our sense of hearing, smell, and touch rather than our eyesight. For he who loses his sight is deprived of the beauty of the universe, and is like to one who is confined during his lifetime in a tomb, in which he enjoys life and motion. Now seest thou not that the eye comprehends the beauty of the whole world? It is the head of astrology. It creates cosmography. It gives counsel and correction to all the human arts. It impels men to seek diverse parts of the world. It is the principle of mathematics. Its science is most certain. It has measured the height and the magnitude of the stars. It has discovered the elements and their abodes. It has been able to predict the events of the future, owing to the course of the stars. It has begotten architecture and perspective and divine painting. O most excellent above all the things created by God! What praise is there that can express thy nobility? What peoples, what tongues, are they who can perfectly describe thy true working? It is the window of the human body through which the soul gazes and feasts on the beauty of the world. By reason of it, the soul is content with its human prison, and without it, this human prison is its torment. And by means of it, human diligence has discovered fire by which the eye wins back what the darkness has stolen from it. It has adorned nature with agriculture and pleasant gardens. But what need is there for me to indulge in long and elevated discourse? What thing is there which acts not by reason of the eye? It impels men from the east to the west. It has discovered navigation, and in this it excels nature, because the simple products of the earth are finite, and the works which the eye makes over to the hands are infinite. As the painter shows in his portrayal of countless forms of animals, herbs, plants, and places. Music, the sister of painting. Music should be given no other name than the sister of painting, inasmuch as it is subject to the hearing, a sense inferior to the eye, and it produces harmony by the unison of its proportioned parts, which are brought into operation at the same moment, and are constrained to come to life and die in one or more harmonic times. And time is, as it were, the circumference of the parts which constitute the harmony, in the same way as the outline constitutes the circumference of limbs whence human beauty emanates. But painting excels and lords over music, because it does not die as soon as it is born, as occurs with music, the less fortunate. On the contrary, it continues to exist and reveals itself to be what it is, a single surface. O marvelous science, thou givest lasting life to the perished beauty of mortals, which are thus made more enduring than the works of nature, for these undergo forever the changes of time, and time leads them to inevitable old age. And this science is to divine nature as its works are to the works of nature, and on this account it is worshipped. Painting and music. The most worthy thing is that which satisfies the most worthy sense. Therefore painting, which satisfies the sense of sight, is more worthy than music, which merely satisfies the hearing. The most worthy thing is that which endures the longest. Therefore music, which is continually dying as soon as it is born, is less worthy than painting, which lasts eternally with the colors of enamel. The most excellent thing is that which is the most universal and contains the greatest variety of things. Therefore painting must be set above all other arts, because it contains all forms which exist, and also those which are not in nature, and it should be glorified and exalted more than music, which deals with the voice only. With it images are made to the gods, around it divine worship is conducted, of which music is a subservient ornament. By means of it pictures are given to lovers of their beloved. By it the beauties are preserved which time and nature the mother render fitful. By it we retain the images of famous men. And if thou wert to say that by committing music to writing you render it eternal, we do the same with letters. Therefore, since thou hast included music among the liberal arts, thou must either exclude it or include the art of letters. And if thou wast to say, painting is used by base men in the same way music is spoilt by him who knows it not. If thou sayest that sciences which are not mechanical are mental, I will answer that painting is mental. And just as music and geometry deal with the proportions of continuous quantities, and arithmetic deals with discontinuous quantities, painting deals with all quantities, and the qualities of the proportions of shadows, lights, and distances in its perspective. Painter and musician. The musician says that his art can be compared with that of the painter, because by the art of the painter a body of many members is composed, and the spectator apprehends its grace in as many harmonious rhythms, as there are times in which it lives and dies, and by these rhythms Its grace plays with the soul, which dwells in the body of the spectator. But the painter replies that the body composed of human limbs does not afford the delectable harmonious rhythms in which beauty must live and die, but renders it permanent for many years, and is of such great excellence that it preserves the life of this harmony of concordant limbs which nature with all her force could not preserve. How many pictures have preserved the semblance of divine beauty of which time or death had in a brief space destroyed the living example? And the work of the painter has become more honored than that of nature, his master. If thou, O musician, sayest that painting is mechanical because it is wrought by the work of the hands, music is wrought by the mouth, but not by the tasting faculties of the mouth, just and as the hand is employed indeed in the case of painting, but not for its faculties of touch. Words are less worthy than actions, but thou, writer of science, dost thou not copy with thy hand, and write what is in thy mind as the painter does? And if thou wast to say that music is formed of proportion, by proportion have I wrought painting, as thou shalt see. Poet, painter, and musician. There is the same difference between the representation of the embodied work of the painter and those of the poet as there is between complete and dismembered bodies, because the poet in describing the beauty or the ugliness of any body reveals it to you limb by limb and at diverse times, and the painter shows the whole at the same time. The poet cannot express in words the true likeness of the limbs which compose a whole, as can the painter, who places it before you with the truth of nature. And the same thing befalls the poet as the musician, who sings by himself a song composed for 4 singers, and he sings the treble first, then the tenor, then the alto, and then the bass, whence there results no grace of harmonious concord such as harmonious rhythms produce. And the poet is like a beautiful countenance which reveals itself to you feature by feature, that by so doing you may never be satisfied by its beauty, which consists of the divine proportion of the limbs united one with another, and these compose of themselves and at one time the divine harmony of this union of limbs, and often deprives the gazer of his liberty. Music, again, by its harmonious rhythm, produces the sweet melodies formed by its various voices, and their harmonious division is lacking to the poet. And although poetry enters into the abode of the intellect by the channel of the hearing, as does music, the poet cannot describe the harmony of music, because it is not in his power to say various things in one and the same moment, as can the harmonious concord of painting, which is composed of various members which exist simultaneously, and the beauty of these parts is apprehended at the same time, individually and collectively with regard to the whole, individually with regard to its component parts of which the whole is formed. And for this reason, the poet is, as far as the representation of bodily things is concerned, greatly inferior to the painter, and as far as invisible things are concerned, he is far behind the musician. But if the poet borrows the aid of the other sciences, he can appear at the fair like the other merchants, bearers of diverse goods made by many artificers, and the poet does this when he borrows the science of others, such as that of the orator, the philosopher, the astrologer, the cosmographer, and the like. And these sciences are altogether alien to the poet. Therefore he is an agent who brings together diverse persons in order to strike a bargain. And if you wish to know the true function of the poet, you will find that he is no other than an assembler of goods stolen from other sciences, with which he makes a deceptive mixture, or more honestly said, a fictitious mixture. And with regard to this fiction, the poet is free to compete with the painter, since it constitutes the least part of the painting. The painter emulates and competes with nature. Painting, a second creation. He who blames painting blames nature, because the works of the painter represent the works of nature, and for this reason he who blames in this fashion lacks feeling. The painter, Lord of all. If the painter wishes to see beautiful things which will enchant him, he is able to beget them. If he wishes to see monstrous things which terrify, or grotesque and laughable things, or truly piteous things, he can dispose of all these. If he wishes to evoke places and deserts, shady or dark retreats in the hot season, he represents them, and likewise warm places in the cold season. If he wishes valleys, if he wishes to descry a great plain from the high summits of the mountains, and if he wishes after this to see the horizon of the sea, he can do so. And from the low valleys he can gaze on the high mountains, or from the high mountains he can scan the low valleys and shores. And in truth, all quantities of things that exist in the universe, either real or imaginary, he has first in his mind and then in his hands. And these things are of so great excellence that they beget a harmonious concord in one glance, as do the things of nature. We can safely say that those people are under a delusion who call that painter a good master, who can only draw well a head or a figure. Certainly there is no great merit if, after studying a single thing during a whole lifetime, you attain to a certain degree of perfection in it. But knowing, as we do, that painting includes and comprehends all the works produced by nature, or brought about by the fortuitous action of man, and in fact everything that the eye can see, he seems to me to be a poor master who can only do one thing well. Now seest thou not how many and diverse acts are performed by men? Seest thou not how many various animals there are, and likewise trees, plants, and flowers? What a variety of mountainous or level places, fountains, rivers, cities, public and private buildings, instruments suitable for human use, how many diverse costumes and ornaments and arts? All these things should be considered of equal effect and value when used by the man who can be called a good painter. End of section 8.
Thoughts on Art, Part 4. Painting and Nature. If you despise painting, which is the only imitator of the visible works of nature, you will certainly despise a subtle invention which with philosophy and subtle speculation apprehends the qualities of forms, backgrounds, places, plants, animals, herbs, and flowers, which are surrounded by light and shade, and truly this is knowledge, and the legitimate offspring of nature, because painting is begotten by nature. But, to be correct, we will say that it is the grandchild of nature, because all visible things are begotten by nature, and these her children have begotten painting. Therefore we shall rightly say that painting is the grandchild of nature and related to God. Were a master to boast that he could remember all the forms and effects of nature, he would certainly appear to me to be graced with great ignorance, inasmuch as these effects are infinite and our memory is not sufficiently capacious to retain them. Therefore, O painter, beware lest in thee the lust of gain should overcome the honor of thy art, for the acquisition of honor is a much greater thing than the glory of wealth. Thus for this and for other reasons which could be given, first strive in drawing to express to the eye in a manifest shape the idea and the fancy originally devised by thy imagination. Then go on adding or removing until thou art satisfied. Then arrange men as models, clothed or nude, according to the intention of thy work, and see that, as regards dimension and size, in accordance with perspective, there is no portion of the work which is not in harmony with reason and natural effects, and this will be the way to win honor in thy art. Painting and Sculpture. I have myself practiced the art of sculpture as well as that of painting, and I have practiced both arts in the same degree. I think, therefore, that I can give an impartial opinion as to which of the two is the most difficult. The most perfect requires the greater talent and is to be preferred. In the first place, sculpture requires a certain light, that is to say, a light from above, and painting carries everywhere with it its light and shade. Sculpture owes its importance to light and shade. The sculptor is aided in this by the relief which is inherent in sculpture, and the painter places the light and shade by the accidental quality of his art in the places where nature would naturally produce it. The sculptor cannot diversify his work by the various colors of objects. Painting is complete in every respect. The perspective of the sculptor appears to be altogether untrue. That of the painter can give the idea of a distance of 100 miles beyond the picture. The sculptors have no aerial perspective. They can neither represent transparent bodies nor reflections, nor bodies as lustrous as mirrors, and other translucent objects, neither mists nor dark skies, nor an infinity of objects which it would be tedious to enumerate. The advantage of sculpture is that it is provided with a better defense against the ravages of time. Although a picture painted on thick copper and covered with white enamel, painted with enamel colors and then put in the fire again and baked, is equally resistant. Such a work, as far as permanence is concerned, exceeds sculpture. They may say that where an error is made, it is not easy to correct it. It is poor reasoning to try and prove that the irremediability of an oversight renders the work more honorable. But I say to you that it will prove more difficult to mend the mind of the master who commits such errors than to repair the work he has spoilt. We know well that an experienced and competent artist will not make mistakes of this kind. On the contrary, acting on sound rules, he will remove so little at a time that his work will be brought to a successful close. Again, the sculptor, if he works in clay or wax, can remove and add, and when the work is finished, it can easily be cast in bronze, and this is the last and most permanent operation of sculpture, inasmuch as that which is merely of marble is liable to destruction. But this is not the case with bronze. Therefore, the picture painted on copper, which with the methods of painting can be reduced or added to, is like bronze, which when it was in the state of a wax model could be reduced or added to. And if sculpture in bronze is durable, this copper and enamel work is more imperishable still, and while the bronze remains black and ugly, this is full of various and delectable colors of infinite variety, as we have described above. If you wish to confine the discussion to painting on panel, I am content to pronounce between it and sculpture, saying that painting is the more beautiful, the more imaginative, and the more copious, and that sculpture is more durable, but has no other advantage. Sculpture with little labor shows what in painting seems to be a miraculous thing to do, to make impalpable objects appear palpable, to give the semblance of relief to flat objects, and distance to objects that are near. In fact, painting is full of infinite resources of which sculpture cannot dispose. Sculpture is not a science, but a mechanical art, because it causes the brow of the artist who practices it to sweat, and wearies his body, and for such an artist the simple proportions of the limbs and the nature of movements and attitudes are all that is essential, and there it ends, and shows to the eye what it is, and it does not cause the spectator to wonder at its nature, as painting does, which in a plain by its science shows vast countries and far-off horizons. The only difference between painting and sculpture is that the sculptor accomplishes his work with the greater bodily fatigue, and the painter with the greater mental fatigue. This is proved by the fact that the sculptor, in practicing his art, is obliged to exert his arms and to strike and shatter the marble or other stone which remains over and above what is needed for the figure which it contains, by manual exercise, accompanied often by profuse sweating, mingled with dust and transforming itself into dirt, and his face is plastered and powdered with the dust of the marble, so that he has the appearance of a baker. And he is covered with minute chips, and it appears as if snow had fallen on him, and his dwelling is dirty and full of chips and the dust of stone. The contrary occurs in the case of the painter. We are speaking of excellent painters and sculptors. Since the painter with great leisure sits before his work well clothed, and handles the light brush dipped in lovely colors, he wears what garments he pleases, his dwelling is full of beautiful pictures, and it is clean. Sometimes he has music or readers of diverse and pleasant works, which, without any noise of hammers or other confused sounds, are heard with great pleasure. There can be no comparison between the talent, art, and theory of painting and that of sculpture, which leaves perspective out of account. Perspective which is produced by the quality of the material and not of the artist. And if the sculptor says that he cannot restore the superabundant substance which has once been removed from his work, I answer that he who removes too much has but little understanding and is no master. Because if he has mastered the proportions, he will not remove anything unnecessarily. Therefore we will say that this disadvantage is inherent in the artist, and not in the material. But I will not speak of such men, for they are spoilers of marble, and not artists. Artists do not trust to the judgment of the eye, because it is always deceptive, as is proved by him who wishes to divide a line into 2 equal parts by the eye, and is often deceived in the experiment. Wherefore the good judges always fear, a fear which is not shared by the ignorant, to trust to their own judgment, and on this account they proceed by continually checking the height, thickness, and breadth of each part, and by so doing accomplish no more than their duty. But painting is marvellously devised of most subtle analyses, of which sculpture is altogether devoid, since its range is of the narrowest. To the sculptor who says that his science is more lasting than that of painting, I answer that this permanence is due to the quality of the material, and not to that of the sculptor, and the sculptor has no right to give himself the credit for it, but he should let it redound to nature which created the material. Painting has a wider intellectual range and is more wonderful and greater as regards its artistic resources than sculpture, because the painter is by necessity constrained to amalgamate his mind with the very mind of nature, and to be the interpreter between nature and art, making with art a commentary on the causes of nature's manifestations, which are the inevitable result of its laws, and showing in what way the likenesses of objects which surround the eye correspond with the true images of the pupil of the eye, and showing among objects of equal size which of them will appear more or less dark, or more or less clear, and among objects equally low, which of them will appear more or less low, or among those of the same height, which of them will appear more or less high, or among objects of equal size, placed at various distances one from the other, why some will appear more clearly than others. And this art embraces and comprehends within itself all visible things, which sculpture in its poverty cannot do. That is, the colors of all objects and their gradations. It represents transparent objects, and the sculptor will show thee natural objects without the painter's devices. The painter will show thee various distances, with the gradations of color producing interposition of the air between the objects and the eye. He will show thee the mists through which the character of objects is with difficulty descried, the rains which clouded mountains and valleys bring with them, the dust which is inherent to and follows the contention between these forces, the rivers which are great or small in volume, the fishes disporting themselves on the surface or at the bottom of these waters, the polished pebbles of various colors which are collected on the washed sands at bottom of rivers, surrounded by floating plants beneath the surface of the water, the stars at diverse heights above us, and in the same manner other innumerable effects to which sculpture cannot attain. Sculpture lacks the beauty of colors, the perspective of colors. It lacks perspective, and it confuses the limits of objects remote from the eye, inasmuch as it represents the limits of objects that are near in the same way as those of distant objects. It does not represent the air which, interposed between the eye and the remote object, conceals that object, but as the veils and draped figures which reveal the naked flesh beneath them. It cannot represent the small pebbles of various colors beneath the surface of the transparent waters. To the painter. And thou, painter, who desirest to achieve the highest excellence in practice, understand that unless thou build it on the solid foundations of nature, thou shalt reap but scant honor and gain by thy work. And if thy foundation is sound, thy works shall be many and good, and bring great honor to thee, and be of great profit. When the work exceeds the ideal of the artist makes scant progress. And when the work falls short of his ideal, it never ceases to improve, unless avarice be an obstacle. He is a poor disciple who does not surpass his master. Counsels. He is a poor master whose work is exalted in his own opinion, and he is on the road to perfection in art whose work falls short of his ideal. Small rooms or dwellings help the mind to concentrate itself. Large rooms are a source of distraction. The painter should be solitary and take note of what he sees and reason with himself, making a choice of the more excellent details of the character of any object he sees. He should be like unto the mirror, which takes the colors of the objects it reflects, and this proceeding will seem to him to be a second nature. The painter in his studio. In order that the favorable disposition of the mind may not be injured by that of the body, the painter or the draftsman should be solitary, and especially when he is occupied with those speculations and thoughts which continually rise up before the eye, and afford materials to be treasured by the memory. If thou art alone, thou wilt belong to thyself only. If thou hast but one companion, thou wilt only half belong to thyself, and ever less in proportion to the indiscretion of his conduct. And if thou hast many companions, thou wilt encounter the same disadvantage. And if thou shouldest say, I will follow my own inclination, I will withdraw into seclusion in order the better to study the forms of natural objects, I say thou wilt with difficulty be able to do this, because thou wilt not be able to refrain from constantly listening to their chatter, and not being able to serve two masters, thou wilt play the part of a companion ill, and still worse will be the evil effect on thy studies in art. And if thou sayest, I will withdraw myself so that their words cannot reach and disturb me, I, with regard to this, say thou wilt be regarded as a madman. But seest thou not that by doing so thou wilt be alone also? Advice to the painter. The mind of the painter must be like unto a mirror, which ever takes the color of the object it reflects, and contains as many images as there are objects before it. Therefore realize, O painter, that thou canst not succeed unless thou art the universal master of imitating, by thy art, every variety of nature's forms, and this thou canst not do save by perceiving them, and retaining them in thy mind. Wherefore, when thou walkest in the country, let thy mind play on various objects. Observe now this thing, and now that thing, making a store of various objects, selected and chosen from those of lesser value. And thou shalt not do as some painters, who, when weary of plying their fancy, dismiss their work from their mind, and take exercise and walking for relaxation, but retain fatigue in the mind, which, though they see various objects, does not apprehend them, but often, when they meet friends and relations and are saluted by them, they are no more conscious of them than if they had met empty air. End of section 9.